In this world, there are dwellers of the dark that can't be perceived by the human eye. These beings often bare their fangs and strike you down. This man has crawled from the depths of hell to protect you from them. He is an emissary of justice. Well, maybe. Japan in the 1990s was defined by a phenomenon commonly referred to as an occult boom, which saw a rise in stories involving demons, spirits, exorcists, urban legends, and many other things of that nature. Or as I like to call it, demonsploitation. This boom was largely spurred on by the underground occult magazine Moo, which had also contributed to the 70s occult boom a few decades prior, but was now really hitting its stride, reaching a larger audience than ever before in the 90s. Within the realm of anime and manga, you may notice this pattern start in the early 90s with Ushio Totora, with the number of occult-related stories increasing each year, with series such as Kishin Doji Zenki, Ghost Sweeper Mikami, Toma Kishinden Oni, all the way to Inuyasha. Stories related to the occult had also become a hot commodity in the pages of Weekly Shonen Jump, in no small part due to the popularity of Yoshihiro Togashi's Yu Yu Hakusho, which had opened the floodgates with its astounding success and ushered in a new era of shonen manga. This would create a domino effect that would trickle down and essentially spawn today's subject. It's about time I introduce you to Weekly Shonen Jump's greatest teacher. His name is Meisuke Nueno, but friends call him Nube, and we're going to have one hell of a time unraveling his tale. Without further ado, let's grab some lube and enjoy some Nube. Let's grab some lube and enjoy some noob? Well, you get the idea. Much like many origin stories in the magazine, This one starts two rookies trying to make a name for themselves within its pages. The fates of Sho Makura and Takeshi Okano would become intertwined when the editorial department at Weekly Shonen Jump paired them together following the premature cancellation of the series they had been working on independently, those being Tengai-kun no Hana no Kan and AT Lady. This was looking to be their last chance at serialization. The two of them had to come up with a smash hit, or they would be out the door with their mangaka careers cut short by the ever-ruthless Weekly Jump chopping block. That is precisely why their newly assigned editor, Hisashi Sasaki, who was also in charge of the iconic delinquent manga Hallelujah 2 Boy, suggested they do an occult-themed story starring a demon as the main character. Makura was intrigued by the idea. However, he wanted this character to be an adult with childlike qualities to him, essentially a man-child. Sasaki wasn't entirely sure that such a protagonist would be cool enough for Jump readers to latch onto. So, as a compromise, he proposed they make him into a school teacher. That way, he could still act like one of the kids, if need be, while also bearing his adult responsibilities. Even so, Makura wasn't too confident in the idea at first. Deep down, he most likely knew it was his last chance to make it big. So, he ended up scrapping it and reworking it several times before serialization began. Everything would change when one day, as a way to help with research, Sasaki brought him a tape of a renowned Japanese exorcist at the time, Mamoru Oda, and proposed that they turn the main character into an exorcist instead. That's when the idea finally clicked in Makura's mind. The main character was going to be a unique, never-before-seen blend of these two elements, a teacher and an exorcist. Okano was aware of the rising popularity of manga pertaining to the occult, as he noticed the only entries for the Jump New Comic Award were all occult stories. When Makura pitched him the concept of a teacher using his spiritual exorcist powers to protect his students, he saw it as a fresh spin on the whole occult business and was immediately on board. They soon decided that Okano was going to handle the art, while Makura would come up with the story. With that settled, it was time for Makura to hit the books then. He started hitting his local bookstore every single day in order to get a variety of works, addressing everything from yokai, uma, and even volumes of the aforementioned Mu occult fanzine to use as research material. He'd plaster sticky notes on anything he deemed interesting enough to write about, and from there, he would start developing the foundation for the manga. Before he could go any further though, there were some special precautions that had to be taken. There was a jinx going around at the time, stating that it's bad luck to portray a demon in a manga. This jinx seemed to have started from the legendary Go Nagai, who was doing a manga called Shuten Doji at the time, which had a notoriously troubled serialization. Since Nube was going to dabble in all the same subject matter, perhaps even more so, both Makura and Okano had to be extra careful. The two of them went to a local shrine in order to get an exorcism themselves, before serialization could start. The way I see it, better safe than sorry. With that layer of protection hopefully acting as a good luck blessing as well, the two of them would publish the very first Jigoku Sensei Nube one-shot. Or should I say, Jigoku Sensei Nubo? That's right, Nube was originally called Nubo in the debut one-shot, but due to a copyright dispute involving a company with a similar name, they had to change it. And as a result of that, the first one-shot wasn't reprinted until the release of Volume 3. Enough about the man's name though. Was the one-shot itself any good? Well, something that immediately stands out about it is how fully formed Nube comes right out of the gate when compared to other shonen manga one-shots. The structure here isn't too different from what a regular chapter of the manga would come to look like. Usually, it goes something like this. One of Nube's students deals with some sort of personal struggle, which leads them to get involved with the yokai of the week, after which Nube swoops into the picture and performs an exorcism on it. And sometimes he needs to unleash his ultimate weapon, his Oni no Te, or demon hand, to do so, while also helping his student overcome said issue and hopefully learn something in the process. You could say Nube is a refreshing protagonist in the sense that, unlike a lot of other shonen heroes, he doesn't have a mentor. He is the mentor for other characters. The biggest difference between the one-shot and the serialized manga is probably Nube's hairstyle. They must have realized it was way too early to give him the shonen protagonist's dead hair. Nevertheless, let's forget the hair and zone in on that hand of his. Through giving Nube a demon hand, Makura was able to stay true to Sasaki's original concept of having the protagonist be a demon, while also not compromising his humanity in the process. You might also notice that the demon hand has an extremely distinctive look. It looks less like the hand of an actual demon and more reptilian in nature. Makura wanted Nube's demon hand to be iconic and stand out from any other demon in the series design-wise. So he told Okano to make his hand more beast-like, giving the shape of a tiger's claws as an example. This gave Okano the idea to come up with something completely different. Naturally, Okano had never seen the actual hand of a demon before, so he had no place to really draw anatomic inspiration from. Instead, he opted to give Nube's hand an alien look, using an art book called the Necronomicon by H.R. Geiger as a reference. Thanks to that, he was able to come up with a completely unique design that managed to be both creepy and cool at the same time. Makura recognized the Geiger influence the moment he laid eyes on the design, and needless to say, he was quite fond of it. The actual idea to give Nube a demon hand came from fellow Jump manga Space Cobra by the late great Buichi Terasawa, in which the main character, Cobra, wears a prosthetic arm, which he can shed on a whim in order to reveal his fierce weapon, deemed the Psycho Gun. Funnily enough, Yu Yu Hakusho would also draw inspiration from it during the chapter Black arc, during which one of Sensui's alternate personalities wields an actual Psycho Gun. Since Nube is an exorcist, originally Makura wanted him to expel demons using Buddhist sutras, the same way a shrine maiden would, for example. But the demon hand definitely gives his character some well-needed edge. What even is the Buddhist sutra that Nube always chants whenever he performs an exorcism anyway? Well, if you're only familiar with the anime, you might not even know that he chants one at all, as it was replaced with an original chant, due to it being too hard to pronounce, supposedly. The sutra he chants is known as the Shiroi Kanon Sutra, Namu Daiji Daihi Kyugu Kyunan, which vaguely translates to Namu Omnipotent Compassion, Salvation from Suffering, and Vast Inspiration, the Shiroi Avalo Kitsvara. As the name implies, the Shiroi Avalo Kitsvara is a kind of Avalo Kitsvara. Kanon is able to reincarnate in 33 forms, depending on the situation, and Shiroi Kanon is one of them. She possesses the power to save people from all kinds of calamities. The anime would opt for an original sutra instead, which states, "The universe and the earth will yield to my power." It's interesting seeing how one of the core aspects of Nube's character, his iconic sutra, is completely different in people's minds, depending on whether they watched the anime or read the manga. Since drawing action scenes wasn't exactly Okano's forte, Makura made it so demons could be expelled in one shot with the demon hand. It's interesting to note that the demon hand wasn't something they planned on using frequently in the story. They envisioned it as more of a last resort crutch for when Nube is in some real trouble. But before they knew it, the demon hand became the main event during battles, as well as the go-to weapon in Nube's arsenal due to its overwhelmingly positive reception with the readers. Jump's reader polls still dictate all at the end of the day. So, with that in mind, how well did the one-shot do? Well, it had actually earned the honorable third spot in that week's popularity polls. While this might seem as if the manga had a bright future ahead of it at first, Bakuman put it best, with a quote that went something along the lines of, "The ranking of the first chapter from a new serialization is more akin to a welcoming gift. The real battle starts from the second chapter onwards." And the battle did indeed start for Makura and Okano, as from that point on, the ranking of the manga would start to decline with each passing chapter, to the point where it was already in danger of getting cancelled only by the third chapter. Even though the two authors were so meticulous when coming up with the manga's mythology, structure, and especially the design of its main character, they still found themselves in this unfortunate situation. How, and more importantly, why did this happen exactly? Perhaps that exorcism they got before serialization started wasn't strong enough, because this was a perfect storm of bad luck, which would come to define the serialization of Nube as a whole. The first major factor to take into consideration is that Nube was being serialized during a time period which has been deemed the golden age of Weekly Shonen Jump. It was a time between the mid-80s and the mid-90s when the circulation of Jump was the highest it had ever been, and untouchable giants such as Dragon Ball, Slam Dunk, and Rokudenashi Blues reigned supreme in the pages of the magazine. This, in turn, elevated the quality standards of the magazine a million times over. Either you had what it took to stand toe-to-toe with the aforementioned manga, or you were out. Makura and Okano were two rookies who had finally gotten their big break after their previous failed attempts, and they were still finding their footing at this point in time. They had only just begun to grasp the sheer insanity that was the world of weekly manga serialization. Not only that, but the second major factor may have something to do with readers making up false expectations in regards to what the manga actually was. Despite Nube being a main character who uses demonic powers to battle against spirits, there was little emphasis put on the battles themselves, and more so on Nube's role as a guardian who protects his students against them. Everyone who went into the manga expecting some bombastic shonen action battles in each chapter most likely jumped ship when they realized this. With that said, Nube appeared to be on life support, and Jump Editorial was just about ready to pull the plug. Makura and Okano had published the 6th chapter, titled The Kappa of the Parallel Bars, and were ready to pack their bags and call it quits. The chapter told the story of a Kappa trying to warn the students of a bomb placed below the parallel bars, which could go off at any moment. But sadly, his communication skills weren't the best, so the students thought he was out to get them instead. That's when a miracle knocked at their door. For the first time since its debut, Nube actually did well in the rankings. So, what went right this time? You see, Nube did not defeat the titular Kappa at the end of the chapter. This made Makura wonder whether it was the right decision to make, but the positive reception from the readers made him realize that people wanted more unconventional stories, ones which weren't bound by the stereotypical framework of what a hero should be. It was a life or death situation for the manga. Yet this one small decision taken by Makura during the writing process allowed Nube to see another day. From then on, Makura realized that the best course of action to take was to continue to betray the reader's expectations by packing some sort of twist, turn, or curveball into each chapter. Even so, the popularity of the manga would not stabilize from that point on. Some chapters would do really well, like the 9th chapter titled The Strolling Ghost, while others would do extremely poorly, such as the one right after it, titled Crash, which took place on a school trip. The Strolling Ghost, featuring Hanako-san, would come to be a surprisingly relevant chapter for Jump as a whole, due to a mistake made by Okano. Back in the day, an ad would sometimes be placed at the bottom half of the middle page of any given chapter. There was an unspoken rule stating that ads had to be placed on the left-hand side of the page, but Okano accidentally placed it on the right. Later on, another artist would make the same mistake specifically because he saw it in Nube. And so, to spare themselves the headache, Jump stopped running ads in the middle of the chapters altogether. That means we've got Nube to thank for everyone getting to enjoy their latest Jump chapters uninterrupted by ads plastered right in the middle. It's interesting how one little mistake like that can alter history as a whole. Despite how cool the Demon Hand was, they didn't want Nube to be too overpowered, thus diminishing the tension and horror of the stories. Which is why, as early as the 8th chapter, Nube's demon hand gets nullified and cut open by a spirit called Hatamomba. It had gotten to the point where Makura and Okano started thinking there really might be some spiritual powers at play, which dictate the performance of any given chapter. In their superstitious stupor, they would come up with various jinxes to avoid falling into while working on the manga as a way to hopefully appease the manga spirits. That is how they enforced a set of golden rules which they would abide by religiously, and they would go as follows. Never set the story outside of school. When the story is a two-parter, one part will inevitably outperform the other. Never show Nube's house or else the manga will end instantly. These might seem ridiculous now, but at the time, Makura and Okano were really desperate and scrambling for any sense of direction or method to this madness. This led to the majority of the stories being set in school after the infamous Chapter 10. The lack of variety in locations really burned me out after a while when I was reading the manga, but it all made a ton more sense when I learned the reason for it. Still, it leads to a surprising amount of chapters having a very similar setup. Usually it's a character returning home from school on the same back alley every single time, only to meet face to face with that week's yokai. You've heard of the Toei Quarry, now get ready for the Nube back alley. Oh boy, I'm just walking home from school. I sure hope no abomination from realms beyond my understanding will show up. They would make up for the lack of locations eventually by having one chapter where Nube tries to go on vacation only to be teleported all over the world. You can really feel just how badly Okano and Co wanted to draw different locations when you read this chapter. With the rules set in place and their will to survive at an all-time high, it was time for the duo to start taking some bolder leaps for the manga. Makura thought there was no better leverage for the declining popularity of a shonen manga than introducing a good rival character. Everyone loves a good old-fashioned shonen rivalry, right? But how exactly do you create a rival for someone like Nube? Enter Yoko Tamamo. He is a demon fox yokai from the clan of Kurama, who descended upon the series in its 11th chapter. Since this was his debut chapter, Makura put extra care and attention into making it as cool and memorable as possible. Meanwhile, Okano made sure to take feedback from his female assistants when coming up with his design. Thanks to that, he became a darling among female readers. Everything was looking great, except neither of them took into account that the majority of Jump readers at the time were elementary school boys. Unlike the girls, they weren't impressed by Tamamo in the slightest. Even though Makura and Okano became extremely meticulous regarding every little detail that would cause the manga to drop in the rankings, they were about to face their greatest crisis yet. It was as if fate itself was mocking their efforts at this point. Tamamo's debut chapter sank Nube all the way to the bottom of the Jump hierarchy. And that's not even the worst part. They had planned a 5-part story arc centered around Tamamo after his introduction. And since they were this far in, they couldn't suddenly change course. It was looking to be the end for Nube. This time for real. Back during the Golden Age, Weekly Shonen Jump was a shonen magazine in both name and spirit, as the ratio of female readers was not nearly as large as it is today. Thus, as a consequence of that, Nube had alienated its main readership, which was elementary school boys, and that was essentially the equivalent of committing manga seppuku. Makura hacked away at the Tamamo arc, trying to shorten it as much as he could. And thanks to that, Nube survived the Tamamo apocalypse by the skin of its teeth. But one thing was clear, it was time for them to make some drastic changes to the story, and fast. That's how the Gakko no Kaidan, or the School Mysteries arc, came to be. These were one and done ghost stories like the manga was known for before the Tamamo arc. Except, they started leaning more heavily into the urban legend aspect of it. Urban legends were really starting to gain traction at the time, so Nube would feature chapters based on all sorts of local legends, as well as some famous ones like the 7 Wonders of School. There was also a change in perspective happening from this point onward. They would shift focus from Nube himself to that of his students, as well as the yokai, which served to emphasize the impact and horror of the stories. It was a change that would help Nube come into its own and carve its own identity in the magazine. In order to attract the readers who had left after the Tamamo arc, Makura wrote the next chapter, which was chapter 16, titled The Midnight Honor Student, with an emphasis on impact. I'd say that definitely does come across, since I would consider it to be one of the most memorable chapters in the manga, featuring a simple yet effective twist regarding said Midnight Honor Student. Makura realized that the real appeal of writing a horror manga is the so-called bad ending, in which the victim is met with a terrible fate. When it comes to shonen manga, bad endings are rarely ever depicted, but he always tried to push the stories as close to the edge as he could, depicting a pinch so bad that the victim might not be able to survive. He was able to get his perfect bad ending out of his system with the Teke Teke chapter, where no one survived at all. More on that in a bit. There's some really solid paneling in Nube. Some of the gags become a lot funnier just because the panel flow is so good. On the flip side, Okano is able to use page turns very effectively for some horrific reveals. This is the true secret behind Nube's horror. Early on, you can still see traces of Makura's original idea of portraying Nube in a very childish manner. But everyone around him kept telling him that since Nube is an adult, he would be way cooler if he acted as such too. As a result of that, you can see a pretty drastic change in Nube's characterization after the Tamamo arc. Still, that doesn't mean Nube isn't portrayed as the butt of the joke most of the time. It really goes a long way to make him more grounded and relatable. Despite being a cool, powerful exorcist, he's still a down-on-his-luck goofball at the end of the day. And you can't help but empathize and root for him. Even for children reading the manga, it makes Nube seem like an achievable role model they could look up to, and not like a larger-than-life superhuman with unrelatable issues. I love that even though Nube doesn't have a lot of money, he always takes his students out for lunch, even if that lunch ends up being cheap corner store ramen most of the time. One could also imagine Makura didn't want Nube to come across as too evil, considering he was a protagonist possessing the powers of a demon, so he steered his characterization as far away from that as possible. Makura continued to focus on impact from that point on, writing stories like the one in chapter 17, Teke Teke no Kaibai, an infamously horrific chapter. It tells the story of a junior high school girl who was cut in half by an oncoming train while trying to cross the railroad. Surprisingly, she was still alive with only her upper body left for about 10 minutes after the accident. Ever since then, the girl's spirit continued to wander around aimlessly, looking for her missing body parts, and she always appears before people who have heard her story. When she shows up, she asks, "Do you need your legs?" And when you answer wrong, she will take your legs. This chapter was based on a real urban legend that was circulating at the time. Originally, it was about a woman instead of a junior high school girl. It also mixed elements from another famous urban legend called Kashima-san. Funnily enough, the chapter does not provide the correct answer to her question, as Makura and Okano would say that neither of them even knows the right answer. Then, chapter 18, Angel-sama, was when Miki finally started to come into her own. The duo would say this was when they felt the students started to stand out as individual characters, rather than generic stock children who just existed to be saved by Nube. That means it's about time we got acquainted with the core group of children in Nube's class. First, there's Hiroshi, the new kid on the block. He's a boy's boy, with nothing but soccer on the brain. Balancing him out is Kyoko, the classic red-headed tsundere, with way more tune than there ever was dere, but she does mellow out somewhat later down the line. Then, as if brought to life by the devil himself, you have Miki. She's the ultimate troublemaker, always coming up with plots and schemes that get herself and everyone else into a boatload of trouble. This girl is an absolute public menace. Someone stop her, please. Finally, there's Makoto. His deal is that he looks and acts like a toddler, but he's actually the same age as everyone else in the class. He's a good surrogate character for younger readers to latch onto. Okano had a policy of portraying the children in a mature way. He would say that back when he was the same age as Hiroshi and Kyoko, he saw himself as a full-fledged adult. In fact, they only ever received complaints from adult readers claiming the students were too mature for elementary school, but the children themselves didn't see anything unusual about it. When it came to drawing yokai or uma, realism was the first thing on Okano's mind. He wanted to make sure the spirits looked like they could actually exist in real life. This all stemmed from a horror manga about the iconic slit-mouthed woman he read as a child, which portrayed her teeth all jagged and weird like shark fangs. Okano couldn't take the manga seriously because of this. So, when it came to drawing his own rendition of the slit-mouthed woman, Okano observed the anatomy of human teeth and even drew clefts at the corners of her mouth as thoroughly and realistically as he was able to. It makes the end result look truly horrifying due to how human-like it is. Okano would do the same for the teeth of other yokai that were originally human, such as the infamous cannibal Mona Lisa. This depiction must have really left an impact on children who grew up with the manga, as Okano recounts one time when Hajime Isayama told him that the designs of the titans in Attack on Titan were influenced by the way the cannibal Mona Lisa ate her victims with her sharp, human-like teeth. Hearing that really thrilled Okano. It made him realize that he got his portrayal of horror over with the readers. And naturally, this was due to the approach Okano had to drawing horror, namely, drawing things that would have scared himself as a child. When Okano was a child, there was a rumor going around regarding the slit-mouthed woman, which sent his school into a panic. Since he went to school by train, he was afraid of going to the station alone. Keeping this experience in mind, he drew the yokai in Nube, specifically to scare children around the same age as he was back then. And well, it worked! Readers were starting to recognize Nube as the magazine's horror series, sending chills down the spines of jump readers from all over Japan. With its newfound reputation as a horror manga, Nube's popularity seemed to have stabilized for the very first time. One aspect that really surprised me about Nube, considering it was serialized in a shonen magazine, was the amount of horrific imagery they were able to get away with. Lots of chapters featured children being put in grotesque body horror situations, which must have made it even more traumatizing for the actual children reading it at the time. It's one thing when you see Nube or other adult characters being put in those situations, and another thing entirely when you see someone that could be you in that very same spot. Noriko was an especially unfortunate character in that regard. But no matter how beloved a character was, no one was safe from being put in dangerous life or death situations. Some of the body horror chapters really got to me even as an adult. Special shout out to the one where Nube gets half his body taken over by a parasite and you can see it moving around all wiggly. It made my skin crawl. Oh, there's also the Eyeball Girl chapter and a whole bunch of others. There's also the Tale of A, one of the most terrifying chapters in the entire manga, which was based on an urban legend going around at the time. There was little time to think about what the next chapter would be about. So, as soon as Makura heard a cool scary story or urban legend, he'd get straight to work and turn it into a chapter of the manga. The story would see a murderer appear in front of children and kill them by different means, depending on their answer to a 3-choice question. The Red Cloak urban legend was used as a basis for it. The twist of this chapter is that it makes you think this murderer is some kind of spirit or yokai. But no, he's really just a messed up regular human. Once you come to that realization, it really sends a chill down your spine, seeing as how this guy was more brutal than all the demons, spirits or yokai we've seen so far combined. What's worse is that he actually gets away with it by the end of the chapter. He's still out there, roaming the streets, looking for his next victim. This page in which Makoto is grabbed by a ghost must be a parody of Kazuo Umezu's Makoto-chan. There's a bunch of random bizarre references like that to other manga that come out of nowhere, so I thought I'd highlight at least a few of them. The story of Otonai-san is passing through in chapter 25, about a spirit who appears when someone leaves a door open, came from one of Okano's assistants, Yuko Asami, who would later go on to write her own manga titled Wild Half in Jump. It was a story she heard as a child, and Makura used it as it was. Since she was self-described as spiritually gifted, it wasn't unusual for her to come up with stories despite being the assistant to an artist. Since it was no easy feat to come up with different scary stories every week, Makura welcomed any suggestions with open arms. Okano used to actually be disgusted by horror stories he'd hear from his assistants throughout the day. While working on the manga, Yuko Asami claimed to have experienced all sorts of strange, unexplained phenomena. Some of these include seeing a woman with an unusually large face clinging to the window of the office, and having a spirit with nothing but a pair of legs running around her home and wreaking havoc. Neither Makura nor Okano consider themselves spiritually gifted people. But out of curiosity, Okano decided to visit her home and inspect these phenomena for himself. Unfortunately, nothing happened while he was there. However, as soon as he left, Asami claimed to have heard a loud creaking noise resonating from within her home. This might have all been a coincidence, but Okano went on to say that yet another assistant working on Nube seemed to have experienced the same kind of phenomena. When Okano popped by the office one day, he casually looked at him and said, "Oh, you've brought a demon with you." According to him, it was a small, hungry-looking demon clinging to Okano's body. Maybe the manga really was cursed after all. Good thing they got those exorcisms beforehand, huh? Even the office itself was an old-fashioned two-story wooden apartment building right at the end of a street. Okano said that, from a feng shui standpoint, it was located in a prime position to allow for spiritual energy to accumulate there. Looking into it further, he discovered that the land around it could not be acquired, and the apartment building seemed to block the road, making it quite the interesting workplace. For the next year and a half, Okano, Asami, and the team of assistants she brought along with her, who all seemed to be either shrine maidens or possess some kind of quirk, would work together in that building. Okano never saw anything strange, but his assistants were terrified. He recalls waking up one morning and finding salt scattered around all corners of the office. Eventually, the apartment got torn down, and a road was built to run through that street. But Okano claims that all these spiritual happenings were spurred on by Asami in the end. Even when Makura tried doing different kinds of stories, such as Chapter 20, titled The Girl Who Brings Happiness, which was a more laid-back, heartwarming tale, readers were still on board with the manga. In fact, that chapter's yokai, Zashiki Warashi, would become a fan favorite. The duo considered turning her into a moe figure. This eased Makura's worries, knowing that he wasn't restricted in regards to the kinds of stories he was able to tell. Even so, Chapter 27, titled Aliens Invade Domori Park, was so unpopular that it ended up being one of the lowest ranked chapters in the entire manga. Back then, aliens weren't really part of the same occult pantheon as spirits and other supernatural phenomena. It wasn't until the X-Files came out that the public started associating them with such. Makura and Okano were simply too ahead of the times with this one. From then on, Hiroshi, Kyoko, and the other students of Nube's class began to feel like actual, fully fleshed out characters. Makura would say that once their personalities had been firmly established, the stories would essentially write themselves. It was smooth sailing for Nube, and the future was certainly looking bright. Some of the character relationships do feel very natural and well realized, like Hiroshi and Kyoko, going from bitter enemies to actually caring for each other and even sort of dating. The chapter in which Miki uses the one-winged crow spell to make Hiroshi fall in love with her turns out to be surprisingly relevant, as during the Bad Future chapter, Miki is actually married to Hiroshi, and then We can see multiple occasions in which Miki competes with Kyoko for Hiroshi's affection, not because she particularly cares for Hiroshi or anything, but because she cannot stand a boy liking anyone other than her. That's a classic Miki moment right there. Then there's Ai, a girl who loves playing the violin, and Makoto, the little fella who's obsessed with Super Sentai. The two of them bond over Ai playing all of Makoto's favorite Sentai themes on violin. These peaceful times would come to a sudden end with chapter 28, titled The Three Animals Murder. Right as Makura and Okano had gotten on the right track and things were beginning to stabilize, the editor in charge of Nube, Hisashi Sasaki, decided to take his leave. Sasaki had been an editor for both Nube and Hallelujah 2 Boy up until that point, and he had just been assigned as the editor for an upcoming manga titled Rurouni Kenshin as well. Realizing that it wasn't feasible for him to be in charge of 3 serializations at the same time, he decided to leave Nube behind. Hisashi Sasaki's last words before leaving Nube were, "It would be better if you two were exposed to the sensibilities of a younger editor." The two of them would say they felt abandoned by him at the time. Not only that, but the last chapter Sasaki was in charge of was the aforementioned unpopular alien one, so he really left them down in the dumps. At least the degree of creative freedom they had would increase tenfold when Mr. S. Tani, the replacement editor, entered the scene. Unlike Sasaki, who had been rather strict with the duo, Tani had a more free-flow approach to his editing. He would approve any kind of story as long as it was fun, or as he would put it, anything goes as long as it's fun. Tani was willing to do whatever it took to make Nube a success. This change of editor might have been a turn for the better after all. Alas, if there's one thing you need to know about Tani is that he is a lover of women. So much does he love them in fact, that Nube would see an influx of female characters waltz into the story during his tenure. It was characters such as Hayame, Yukime, and Izuna that would breathe life into the manga and give it a brand new Bishoujo appeal. Chapter 30, titled Nagori Yuki, Season of the Snow Woman, would see the debut of arguably the most popular character in the manga besides Nube himself, Yukime. She's the manic pixie yandere BPD snow woman every single 25-year-old underpaid teacher dreams of. She's also the one girl who actually shows interest in Nube. Unfortunately for him, she's a yokai, the very thing he fights against chapter by chapter. Not only do they come from different worlds, but Nube would soon find out that Yukime plans to encase him in ice so they could spend eternity together. It's apparently a snow woman tradition, and as romantic as it may sound, Nube has other plans. Hence, he has to swallow his pride and get rid of his snow-powered lover. That's what I call an ice-cold killer. While Makura first thought of her as a generic one-off antagonist, due to her tremendous popularity, she would show up again and again. She was popular with male readers, it goes without saying, but she also grew a following among female ones. Mizuki Kawashita, author of fellow Jump manga Ichigo 100%, also went on record to state that she was a fan of Yukime. While on the topic, one of the heroines in fellow Jump manga Nurari Hyon no Mago, named Tsurara, is also a snow woman. Her personality is quite similar to Yukime, and just like her, she became more popular than the human heroines Kana and Yura by a long shot. Could this be a sign that any snow women heroines in Jump are bound to be best girls? I'll let you guys decide that one. Chapter 32, Yokai Rokurokubi, in which Miki becomes a Rokurokubi, would become one of the most iconic chapters in the entire manga. Apparently, it was very popular in the anime as well. My favorite part about the whole thing is that Miki lives on as a Rokurokubi until the end of the manga. Nube isn't able to cure her or anything, and you can see her dangling her long neck around at numerous points from that chapter onwards. A staff member at Toei Animation would go on record to say that most stories starring Miki did very well in the ratings. It makes sense, since female characters like Miki, who were quite reckless and spunky, weren't commonplace in shonen manga at the time. Editors used to think that writing female characters like Miki would lead to them being disliked by readers and their popularity would decline. But Miki's success served to turn that notion on its head. This led to a shift in the reader's perception of Nube yet again. It was no longer known as the horror manga of Jump, but rather the Bishoujo manga instead, with the ladies becoming its main event and lead drawing factor. Tani's personal preferences were reflected within the manga itself, and it looks like Makura and Okano had adapted to them quite well. You could say Nube is a versatile manga in that sense. It is able to change and evolve into whatever the editor demands of it, all with the sole goal of surviving another week. Thanks to its adaptability, Nube managed to reach its first anniversary of serialization under the guidance of Mr. Tani. Chapters 36 and 37, Near-Death Experience and the Ushinokoku Shrine Visitor, are fairly interesting in the sense that Makura and Okano have absolutely no recollection of making them. Guess they didn't feel too strongly about this particular story, even though Hiroshi is on the verge of death, which is pretty funny. The 42nd chapter, titled The Ghosts of the Fourth Course, was notable for being a story about Nube's junior high school days, which had been shrouded in mystery up until then, so it performed pretty damn well. There was also an incident involving Okano's wife during its production, however. His wife put a sticky substance in Nube's hair without asking for permission beforehand. You see, Okano had specified that a lighter tone should be applied to the hair since he had a ghost body, so his hair should be transparent as well. But Okano's wife thought he would still look better with black hair, so she sneakily applied the tone while he was out of the office. Even his assistants took her side on the matter in the end. Okano was quite depressed to see all of this unfold, but when Makura himself told him his wife had the right idea, he decided to cut his losses. The 43rd chapter, titled Transformation Pompokopon, showed Nube in the nude, and the duo were surprised the editorial department let them get away with it. This also led to a heated debate about Nube's demon member in the making of section. Chapter 48, titled Yokai Great Gathering, was a big one. It featured all the yokai that had appeared in the story up until that point. Makura envisioned it being done in a style that paid homage to old tokusatsu shows, where all the monsters who had previously been defeated come back for one last round against the hero. Okano was asked by an acquaintance whether he was going to cut corners and reuse his old drawings, but he actually redrew them all by hand, claiming he's no mangataro after all. The following chapter, titled Midsummer Snow Woman, marked Yukime's reappearance and her introduction as a full-fledged cast member. One of my favorite Yukime gags has to be whenever she turns into this goofy-looking snowman to cool off because she can't stand human temperatures. That, or whenever she knocks on the window of Nube's classroom while he's in the middle of a lesson and prepares to crush it with a giant snowball as she grows increasingly irritated with being ignored by him. Now, chapter 51, titled Dream Eater Baku, remains an extremely bitter memory for Okano to this very day. The yokai of the week was based on a sculpture called the Tower of Humanity, considered a true work of art. Because of that, Okano thought it would be okay to remain accurate to the motif, so he drew an extremely detailed penis onto it. You can imagine how outraged the editorial department was. They summoned him to the Jump offices in the middle of the night in order to erase every penis one by one with his own hands. Okano remembers sitting there and thinking, what am I doing with my life? As he was erasing penises in the middle of the night. He felt miserable. The editorial department must have forgiven him in the end, because they allowed nudity from that point onward, as long as it was covered with the Jump logo, essentially making Nube the pioneer of that iconic censorship technique you see in Jump manga to this very day. The 4th volume release of Nube contains a new story called September's Requiem. It is a story that had been rejected during serialization, and Okano even made new art for it in the volume release. It is quite a sad tale too, and the 5th volume would go in depth explaining why it had been rejected in the first place. The 59th chapter received a color page in the front and center of the magazine as congratulations. While there had been color pages before for the 1st and 4th chapters, they were more like housewarming gifts for the new serialization. This was the first color page Makura and Okano had earned by themselves, through their own blood, sweat, and tears. It was a long and tumultuous road to get there, but all of their struggles had culminated in this one color page. It must have been an emotional moment for our duo. This also marked the point where Nube would receive its first yearly character popularity poll, with the results being as follows. Nube would get first place, followed by Hiroshi, Kyoko, Miki, and finally Makoto. The 5 of them would be the essential core cast of Nube moving forward, with Katsuya popping in as an honorary member. He's the class delinquent, and worst of all, a gamer. Katsuya was originally a background character, and they never had any intention of including him into the main cast. However, when Makura saw Okano's design for him, he noticed a striking resemblance to Kai from Gundam 0079. That's how Katsuya's delinquent characterization was established. It also made the duo aware of the fact that they both liked Gundam. Makura would say his favorite is 0079, while Okano's favorites are both 0079 and Mobile Fighter G Gundam. When it came to Kyoko's design, it wasn't inspired by Sailor Moon as some readers had speculated, but rather the obscure Ken Ishikawa magical girl series Majoko Tickle. As for Hiroshi, his look was influenced by Alfred Yuzuruha from Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket. Aside from them, some minor students would pop in and out of the story here and there, such as Masaru Kaneda, the Eric Cartman looking kid. He's so much of a minor character that he isn't even referred to by his first name in the entirety of the manga. Everyone either calls him Kaneda or Kaneda-kun. No wonder it became a running gag for him to complain about his treatment in the story, and lack of time in the spotlight. While that may be the case, Kaneda does get his share of memorable moments in the manga. That one chapter where he befriends Ayumi Kinoshita, a wheelchair-bound girl, and awakens to the joy of reading, really shows his potential for development. Ayumi is afraid of going to school because of her disability, so Nube taught her to astral project and have her projection attend school instead as a way to deal with her fears. Once Kaneda finds out about this, he swears to protect her from bullies and encourages her to return to school in her true form and have fun with everyone else in spite of her disability. He's like a modern Wu's Lu Meng. At least in the anime, the other characters do call him by his name. So in the end, he still gotta win. There's also Akira, a shy, geeky, bespectacled kid who used to be part of the core cast of Nube early on. He was even the protagonist in the one-shot chapter. but would take more of a backseat as the manga went on. Makura realized he made him a bit too serious for him to really play an active role in the class. So he ended up making some drastic changes to his character in order to make him more usable in the story. Starting with chapter 101 titled The Devil's Great Invention, the Hieronymus Machine. Akira would be portrayed as a mad scientist type of character. This worked out great for his character, as it gave him his own unique gimmick to make him stand out from the rest of the students, while also allowing for some fun chapters involving whatever crazy invention he came up with that week. He was like a mini version of the Reanimator. The only downside seemed to be that Akira was way less popular with female readers all of a sudden, who had grown attached to his previous characterization. They would claim, "We don't want this broken Akira." This kid really can't catch a break now, can he? Yuka Kobayashi is another interesting minor student who made her first appearance in chapter 88 titled Amano Jaku. She is a tomboy with attitude, and her character seems really well defined right from the start. Despite that, she would only play the lead role in this one chapter and would be relegated to background appearances from then on out. From that one chapter, it really seemed like they were setting her up to be a mainstay of Nube's class. However, on the contrary, even though all the main characters would appear on the cover of the manga's last volume, Yuka was the only character Okano forgot to draw. That's no way to treat a lady now. After reflecting on this, Okano made sure to portray her in the 7th volume of the Bunko edition, even going as far as to give her a color illustration, and of course, she would get her belated appearance on the cover of the final volume in the Bunko edition. Matsui is another underrated minor character in Nube's school. He's a fellow teacher who is obsessed with plasma, the same way Nube is obsessed with spirits, and the two of them butt heads over it all the time. He's even got his own Ghostbusters vacuum cleaner. He only ever appeared at key points in the story and left a huge impact on the readers due to being such a goofy, high-energy character. Makura would say he is a very kind-hearted man. He also wanted to make more chapters based around him, but everyone else was against the idea, so he never went through with it. If you'll allow me to get geographical for a moment, one can't help but notice that most of the supporting characters in Nube would reside in Japan's Tohoku region. When Makura was looking up ghost stories for research, he noticed many of them were set in the Tohoku region. This is said to have stemmed from Kunio Yanagida's Tales of Tono novel, but he also imagined spirits and ghosts would feel more at home in the snowy plains of Tohoku than, say, Okinawa. Makura, being from the Aichi prefecture, always got the impression that the southern part of Japan is more cheerful and less frightening than the north. The manga itself takes place in the fictional town of Domori Park. At the end of one of the volumes, we actually get an outline of it. Domori Park is described as a medium-sized town with mountains and valleys, but not big enough to be considered a city. As the manga went on though, Domori Park would become a sort of catch-all town with streets looking like the center of Shibuya, fishing grounds, farming villages, a huge amusement park, among others. Nube would also spawn its own share of urban legends. In the 20th volume of the manga, there is a panel which shows the entirety of Nube's class, and there seem to be 24 students in total. Not counting the ghost student who was supposed to transfer to Nube's class but got into a car accident on the way there, so he became a ghost haunting the class instead. It's a whole thing. Hiroshi and Kyoko, being the most popular, starred in the most amount of chapters. Noriko and Akira were only semi-regulars. Shizuka and Yuka only starred in one chapter each. Matsui never starred in a chapter, but he had a strong presence early on. And there's background characters who never had any speaking lines. That's all 24 of them, right? Wait a sec, why are there 25? There is a mysterious girl sporting a ponytail in the top left corner. She never appeared before or after this group shot. Was she supposed to be introduced in Nube's class at one point? But Makura and Okano forgot about her? This mystery remains unsolved to this day. After a year of weekly serialization, it seemed as if the school ghost stories arc was running out of steam, and readers were starting to move on. While the arc featured stories based on the 7 wonders of school, were there really 7 of them? Let's count and see. The 13th Step was adapted in chapter 19, The Love Crows was adapted in chapter 40, 12 AM Future Mirror was adapted in chapter 41, The Man-Eating Mona Lisa was adapted in chapter 34, Kinjiro Ninomiya Runs at Night was adapted in chapter 46, and The Anatomy Model Who Cleans Up After School was adapted in chapter 16. And that leaves us with one more mystery left unadapted. Well, hold that thought. This meant that it was time to switch things up once more, and so Makura and Okano would plan the next leverage operation. Their brainstorming session led them to 3 major elements they would focus on exclusively moving forward, if they want to avoid cancellation. Their plan of action was as follows. Start going all in on the romantic comedy gimmick. Romantic comedy chapters seemed to resonate with readers in the past, so the natural course of action was to double down on them. Since Nube started to have some brand recognition in regards to its world and characters, they decided to focus more on the interpersonal relationships between the characters rather than completely inconsequential episodic stories. And so they took Ritsuko, a character who up until that point existed to be a gag regarding Nube's one-sided crush on her, and remodeled her into a fleshed-out character who would stand toe-to-toe against Yukime, completing the iconic romantic comedy love triangle for Nube's affection. Ritsuko had been in the manga since the very beginning, and was always portrayed as Nube's ideal woman, but she was mostly played for gags, always being subjected to scary or weirdly erotic experiences by Nube. Makura and Okano saw her as too comedic and delicate to be the main heroine. But with the dawn of Yukime, who quickly filled that role, the significance of her existence in the manga began to be put into question. However, there was one chapter that would change everything. Chapter 68, Yokai Shokera Peeks Through the Window, would be told from Ritsuko's point of view. Ritsuko would overcome her usual scaredy nature and stand up to the yokai of the week, Shokera. Ritsuko's courageous act managed to move the readers. In addition, this chapter would mark the point Ritsuko would find out about Nube's true nature as a demon hand-wielding exorcist, which recontextualizes their past interactions in her mind and makes her fall in love with him. The Nube Bowl, which up until that point had been dominated by Yukime, now had a new love rival. Some readers would even switch camps from Yukime to Ritsuko in the wake of this chapter. With that, the romantic comedy love triangle would come to fruition. Her unwavering determination to compete against the powerhouse that was Yukime would prove very admirable. The future of Nube now had a rock-solid foundation. The only thing they were missing now was an ongoing storyline that would replace the previous School Ghost Stories arc. Makura decided to give urban legends a rest and go all in on yokai from then on. That's how he came up with the Japanese Spirits arc. While Nube had dabbled in stories relating to yokai and traditional Japanese folklore in the past, with Zashiki Warashi and Kaname being the 2 biggest examples, from that point onward, the spotlight would be put exclusively on Japanese yokai, with the last piece of the puzzle at last coming into place. The duo would officially start the Japanese Spirits arc with chapter 68, titled Nekomata. It would continue on for a while, and Nube's perception in the eyes of Jump readers would once again morph from the Bishoujo manga of Jump into the yokai manga from then on. There's some really creative premises to some of these chapters, like the one where a yokai will ask you how much money you'd like to receive, and then he brings you 3 challengers directly proportional to the sum you chose, coming in from weakest to strongest. The money you receive at the end gets divided by the challengers you manage to defeat. The Yokai Encyclopedia segments at the end of each chapter were really cool and quite educational, which is fitting for a manga with a teacher as its protagonist. The anime even took them and turned them into a special episode bundled with the DVD. The manga would also feature lots of fan-submitted yokai, with both the male and female submissions receiving their own special chapters. The designs are very creative and fun, which makes these chapters an absolute joy to read. Despite this shift, Mr. Tani would still personally request that they introduce as many beautifully sculpted female characters as the duo could fit into the manga, altering the manga's scope to match his personal interests. With that, Makura and Okano got straight to work. The 67th chapter, titled The Mermaid's Revenge, saw the debut of the iconic mermaid Hayame. Nube saved her life in her debut chapter, and as a result of that, she became obsessed with wanting Nube to eat her flesh. Eating a mermaid's flesh would grant one immortality, which Hayame sees as the ultimate form of gratitude for his heroic act. Nube would kindly refuse her offer, which turned out to be for the best. Later on, we would meet a lady who actually took Hayame on her offer, and completely lost her mind to the point where she made it her life's mission to end Hayame, instead for bestowing this curse upon her. Truth be told, she could have been cured of her immortality by eating Hayame's heart, but Hayame had to give it to Nube instead after he got injured protecting her from that very same lady. Talk about tough luck. From that point on, Hayame would become a reliable presence in the manga and the designated healer during the more serious moments. Some of the other yokai would get more development as they would show up again during this era, such as the Kuchisake Onna and her 3 equally slit-mouthed sisters. Then, a few chapters later, she was followed up by Izuna, the Itako gal, who would also become a staple of the manga. Although, part of me thinks she was initially created just for the sake of that pun. Izuna would make her debut in chapter 74 and would make several appearances up until the end of the manga. During her debut, Izuna makes her goals very clear to Nube. She wants to make the most out of her natural talent as an Itako and use her abilities to become rich and famous. This might have been a simple goal for her, but it never wavered up until the very end. Izuna would even receive her own spin-off manga, and even in that series, the goals she set for herself at the start of Nube would remain the same, with her still working hard to achieve them. This makes her a very consistent and compelling character to follow in the long run. The chapter where Izuna spontaneously combusts whenever she tries to talk to the boy she likes is such a fun one too. She's portrayed as extremely cocky and sure of herself early on, to the point where she even tries to play God one time, to more than disastrous results. Either way, our duo's battle plan was starting to take shape. The manga was blending its 3 central themes of romantic comedy, beautiful girls, and Japanese yokai in a really unique way. It gave Nube a sort of old-school, low-budget exploitation film feel to it. Everything was coming together nicely, and the readers were receptive to the changes. Their operation had been a great success, and the popularity of Nube had not only skyrocketed, but it had also stabilized for the very first time in what seems like forever. Makura would claim this wasn't some grand master plan he meticulously put together, but rather something he did out of desperation in the spur of the moment, to keep the manga going. Or as he would put it, I was just desperate. There was no time to strategize anyway. At least not when you're on the weekly serialization grind, with the looming jump guillotine hanging menacingly above your head at every wrong turn you take. Makura merely saw the 3 elements readers responded best to and corrected the trajectory of Nube accordingly. Meanwhile, traditional battle manga were starting to gain momentum in Weekly Jump. Battles had never been the focus of Nube as a narrative. On the contrary, Nube would always try to solve conflicts peacefully and would only resort to violence if there was no other option available. Even then, in chapters such as 84 titled Kirin, Nube is unable to stand up to a god-class demon he encountered for the very first time. In the end, it was Katsuya's good deeds that saved him from being executed by the Kirin, bringing a peaceful end to the chapter's conflict. Readers found the lack of battles quite disappointing, since it was what they've come to expect from the magazine, and Nube was simply refusing to provide them with it. The editor-in-chief at Jump was constantly screaming in Makura's ear about it, telling him to take the plunge and turn Nube into a full-on battle manga, featuring lots of hot-blooded showdowns. But Makura was always dodging his demands. Makura would reflect back on this and claim that perhaps this was the reason for the harsh and cold treatment he received from the editorial department throughout serialization. Chapter 91 is definitely a standout one. It's got this macabre tone that we'd never seen before or after in the manga. The story sees Nube trapped in a cave while out on a hike, and he ends up bringing the skeleton of a woman who died in that cave back to life, just so he doesn't lose his mind. He knows full well that he'll have to end her life again if he manages to survive, and the anticipation is quite chilling. It might have been inspired by a similar story featured in fellow Jump manga The Outer Zone, which in itself was a spoof on The Twilight Zone. Since Nube's popularity had stabilized to the point where even if a chapter tanked in the rankings, they wouldn't be on the brink of cancellation anymore, it was time to open up some old fox-shaped wounds. Hence, the 96th chapter would see the return of the cursed Yoko Tamamo to the world of Nube. Makura and Okano had received some passionate letters from female fans begging them to bring him back, but the two of them had been so traumatized by what happened last time that they kept putting it off. Well, it was finally time to rip off that band-aid. They still made sure to take the precaution of having Tamamo change career paths from a substitute teacher to a doctor. This was done because if Tamamo were to remain a substitute teacher, he would have to be featured as a recurring character. And if this chapter were to tank the rankings once more, they couldn't whack him out of the story tactfully enough for the readers not to notice something was wrong. Thus, the new gimmick of Tamamo the Doctor was born. Luckily for him, his reintroduction into the story turned out to be very popular, to the point where it increased Nube's ranking instead of decreasing it. At long last, Tamamo got the redemption he deserved, and he would continue to be a regular cast member from that point onward. I figured this would be the best time to look back on his progression as a character. Yoko Tamamo started out as a ticking time bomb. He had just hijacked some unfortunate soul's body, giving him only so much time to achieve his goal of stealing Hiroshi's skull and unlocking his latent power before his stolen body gave out on him. Once Nube taught him a lesson, his goal would shift to being that of understanding the source of Nube's spiritual power. Until he could figure that out, he became a doctor and began studying human emotions and behaviors, learning more about humanity through helping others. This leads to some great stories about Tamamo trying to understand human emotions, like the one in chapter 107 where he encounters the grieving lover of the person whose body he took over. There's also chapter 115 in which he takes a feral werewolf boy under his wing because he sees himself in him. It would also show that Nube was branching out to Western yokai too, between this and a vampire chapter beforehand. Then, in chapter 183, Tamamo discovers just how desperately some humans are willing to cling to life, and how full of surprises they can be. He even bonds with the little girl through her collection of snails. The stories involving Tamamo would always take place in these slick, stylish, urban cityscapes at night. Sometimes, you'd even see the Domori Tower, which looked just like the Tokyo Tower. This made readers think that the story is set in the Akasaka area. But no, Makura would say it's still just a port with a cityscape within the Omori. The humor in Nube is definitely one of its strong suits. There are lots of great visual gags, and even some fourth wall breaking, like Hiroshi telling Tamamo that he's legally obligated to be a good guy now. Because that's the fate of all Jump antagonists who get beaten once. Chapter 97, titled The Strongest Enemy, would see Nube go up against the god of poverty. Once Nube is possessed by said god, every ounce of good luck is drained out of him, and he is plunged into the depths of despair as he runs out of money at an alarming rate. This was the most serious rival Nube had faced up until that point. It was a compelling story which gave Nube a sense of powerlessness. Somehow, it was more than fitting for his character that his strongest enemy would be the god of poverty. The staff at Toei must have thought the same, considering they decided to feature it as the second to last episode of the anime. Since the last episode took place in a dark, alternate future, the god of poverty was technically the final antagonist of Nube's anime adaptation. It was a very fitting end too, seeing all the characters Nube had helped and bonded with come to his side when he needed it the most. The connections Nube had formed ended up being more valuable than all the money in the world, since they were all that was left at the end. It's a chapter that highlights the core of Nube as a character, his kindness. It's his willingness to risk his life for others while expecting nothing in return that ultimately makes him work as a character. That is Minako's inherited will. The same way she helped him all those years ago. It's up to him to carry that weight and pass it on to his students. This is Nube's greatest lesson. Well, it took us a little over 100 chapters, but we have finally reached the peak of Nube, so you better strap in. This was the absolute height of Nube's popularity in Jump's rankings, achieving numbers the duo never thought possible. As Nube entered its third year of serialization, Makura decided it was about time he revealed the origin of the Demon Hand, a mystery readers had been speculating about since the very first chapter. And so, there it was in the 102nd chapter, titled The Secret of the Demon Hand, Part 1. We open to a color page drawn with utmost care by Okano. Just by looking at it, you can tell the manga wasn't playing around this time. The chapter tells the story of Nube's own teacher and role model, Minako, who was always there for him and helped him cope with his spiritual awakening. Eventually, when the strongest demon of hell, Baki, shows up at the school, Minako is left with no choice but to sacrifice her own being in order to seal him away, and using Nube's unfortunate hand as a container. The manga does a great job at making Baki seem more threatening than all the demons Nube had faced up until that point. You look at this double-page spread and you think, damn, Nube really is in trouble now. Readers must have been dying to know the Demon Hand's origins, because this chapter ranked number 2 in Jump that week, marking this as Nube's all-time highest ranking thus far. Will Nube be able to maintain this momentum and perhaps even claw its way to becoming the most popular manga in all of Jump? The very next chapter, titled The Ghost of the Riding Warrior, seemed to have other plans. This chapter was a massive blow to Nube's ranking. It seemed as if all the momentum and goodwill they had built up with the secret of the Demon Hand had evaporated into thin air. What exactly went wrong this time? Believe it or not, it was as simple as readers expecting the manga to unveil more exciting developments following the Demon Hand's origin. They probably thought it was a setup for a longer arc, which would take the story in a more serious direction, and they most likely lost interest once they noticed the manga returned to its usual episodic stories in the next chapter. Looks like Nube's popularity hadn't stabilized after all. The duo were essentially back to square one. Still, There was no time to mope around because Toei Animation had just greenlit an anime adaptation for Nube. Makura was especially eager to see his work animated. He even mapped out the entire opening sequence in his head before an anime was ever in the cards. Makura was even thinking about anime when designing the logo for Nube. He specifically wanted it to have an anime feel to it. Even the title itself is very anime oriented, in the sense that it is composed of 4 kanji characters plus the main character's name. This was a pattern that many anime followed back then, especially mecha anime. Due to the broadcasting code of the time, several changes had to be made to the story before the character designs were even finished. For instance, the chapter involving the slit-mouthed woman, which was emblematic for establishing Nube's identity early on, as well as the morbid Teke Teke chapter, had to be taken out due to being too graphic and horrific to be shown on TV. Both Makura and Okano were starting to worry about the production because of this. There was nothing they could do about it, however. So the anime production marched forward. Due to Nube's rapid declining popularity in the wake of The Secret of the Demon Hand, the duo were also worried the manga might get canned before the anime even premiered. It was time for the manga to shift gears one more time then. They've done urban legends, they've done Japanese folklore. They needed something new, something weirder. Hence the duo would debut The Weird Files. This was naturally inspired by the soaring popularity of the show X-Files around that time. This allowed the story of Nube to broaden its scope to any paranormal phenomena, from UFOs to UMAs. The change was accompanied by the case reports showing up at the end of the chapters. These gave the stories a sense of realism, since most of them were based on actual real-life events or occurrences. The tone of the stories themselves became more tense and less silly around this time too. This third rebrand was very well received. Nube had managed to dodge its execution date once more, and was now cruising upwards through the jump rankings the way it used to. This success would also provide more impetus to the anime adaptation. There was still one ice-cold issue sending a chill down the duo's spines, however. Enter the Yukime conundrum. It was a behind-the-scenes fiasco of unparalleled proportions. Following the success of the Weird Files rebrand, Makura was left in an awkward position regarding all the yokai characters who no longer had a place in the world of Nube. Since yokai were no longer the main focus of the manga, they began to be featured less prominently. While Makura was worried about having them disappear spontaneously into the ether, he knew he could get away with it, since most of them weren't major players anyway. However, Yukime was the one character he could not do that with. That's what brought him to the hard decision of strangling the life out of her with his own 2 hands. It was unheard of for a shonen manga to casually kill off its main heroine like that. Especially back then, it was a decision which shook the readers to their very core. Truth be told, Makura had always planned to get rid of Yukime eventually, considering she was supposed to be nothing more than a one-off character, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to finally pull the trigger. Makura would state that he felt as if he already told all the stories he wanted to tell related to Yukime, so he didn't think twice about his decision to have her meet her demise. Okano agreed with his proposal, which led to the death of Yukime, hitting the printing press of that week's jump. It was a very dramatic chapter for Nube standards, and the response from the readers was tremendous as well. Makura and Okano were soon flooded with letters from mourning readers, begging them to bring her back. It was clear that this chapter left a scar on the hearts of many readers. They had no time to worry about the readers' feelings, however. Now that they had washed their hands from this Yukime business for good, the two of them could focus their efforts exclusively on the weird file arc. That's what I'd like to say, but things are never that simple. Especially things of this magnitude. The first chapter which followed Yukime's demise, chapter 111, titled Uma, received the sharpest decline in rankings the manga had seen up until that point. This wasn't caused by the quality of the story itself, but rather because of Nube's weird continuity, or lack thereof, I should say. The characters, much like Makura and Okano, had simply moved on from Yukime and resumed their episodic adventures as if nothing ever happened. There wasn't even a single mention of Yukime in the entire chapter. Everyone was laughing and joking around as usual. Even Nube, who was in tears over Yukime in the previous chapter, appears to have moved on and is at peace with the situation. Seeing this made readers, who had been attached to Yukime over the span of these 100+ chapters, very uncomfortable. It seemed disrespectful to her character to just sweep her passing under the rug like that. The complete tonal whiplash between the two chapters made for a strange and frankly off-putting reading experience. Makura was of the impression that the story would become too dark if they were to drag on the fallout of Yukime's death forever. He saw it as the conclusion to her character arc. A complete saga, if you will. And he wanted nothing more than to move on and tell other kinds of stories. Between the reception of this chapter and The Secret of the Demon Hand, it was time for the duo to acknowledge a new jinx they would add to the ever-expanding Nube lexicon, namely, any chapter that immediately follows a serious or dramatic one will tank the rankings. Keep an eye on this pattern as we move forward. It would take until the 119th chapter for us to get a glimpse of how Nube felt about losing Yukime, as he would open up about it for the first time. Despite Makura's feelings on the matter, he felt as if he owed it to the readers to include a scene like this in at least one chapter. This one scene rekindled the reader's goodwill towards the manga, and it was met with positive reception overall. That's precisely when the word revival started floating around in Makura's mind. The readers managed to win Makura over at last. Their cries must have finally reached his ears. You could say the season of the Snow Woman is upon us because Yukime had it rose. At least, that's what readers were led to believe at first. The reason for her revival was, in reality, business and commercially driven once more, much like her passing. This time, the circumstance was the anime adaptation. The anime production was rapidly approaching Yukime's first appearance, and the editorial department didn't want people to get attached to a character who, despite being all cheerful and silly in the anime, was dead and buried in the original source material. Thus, Operation Resurrect Yukime came into effect. Yukime, who had been dead since chapter 110, would return to the world of Nube only 4 months later in chapter 126. Her death ended up being so short-lived that many readers wouldn't even realize or remember that she had died before. The complete tonal whiplash between 2 consecutive chapters of Nube never fails to get to me. Like, here we have chapter 126, a very emotional tale featuring Yukime's revival. And then you're hit with Titty Central the second you flip the page to the next chapter. Chapter 182 is probably the prime example of this type of tonal whiplash I'm talking about. It starts with Nube groping some woman at a bar, only for his demon hand to start acting up afterwards. The reason for it ends up being that Minako is still sentient inside the hand, and she wanted to punish Nube for being a perv. It's so on brand for the manga to drop a pretty significant plot revelation like this upon the reader in a random ecchi chapter. Wait a sec. If Minako was able to see Nube all this time, does that mean she even sees him when he... Moving on. Yukime's resurrection would also open a Pandora's box that could no longer be avoided. Back in chapter 110, right before Yukime's passing, Nube would at last confess his feelings for her. That meant now, since Yukime had been resurrected, the two of them would finally become a couple and live happily ever after, right? Makura was afraid of letting them get together. He didn't want to lose the romantic comedy aspect of Nube, something he considered a valuable crutch, which had kept the manga afloat whenever it was in a pinch. Makura was now stuck between a rock and a hard place, having the unenviable task of coming up with a compromise that would both keep the readers happy while not messing with the previously established status quo. The solution he came up with was giving Yukime an unexpected case of amnesia. And to make things even more confusing, she also claims to have been imbued with a different personality. This brings the implication that this new Yukime was not the same one as before, but a completely different person, I guess? Okano was just as confused when reading the script for this chapter. He went over to ask Makura for some clarification, only for Makura to vehemently claim that she was still the same Yukime as before. With his confusion alleviated a little bit, Okano went to work on the chapter. Then, during a meeting with Mr. Tani, while they were checking over the notes for the chapter, Tani told him that Yukime was supposed to be a different person after all. Or at least so he thought. Okano's eyes must have been swirling like an anime character at this point. Which one was it in the end? Even though Okano had no idea what was even happening anymore, he had no time to think about it with the deadline drawing ever closer, so he went straight to drawing. This chapter sparked a ton of theories and speculation among readers. Was that the same Yukime as before? Was it a different person? These sorts of playground rumors were flying around left and right. Readers were just as bewildered as Okano was drawing the thing. The most hilarious part about this whole ordeal is that the story moved on without elaborating further or acknowledging this situation at all. Then, to add insult to injury, Mr. Tani had to step down as editor for the manga. And well, he was the one in charge of that whole storyline to begin with. Yukime seemed to have been left floating in limbo. She would make sporadic appearances after that point, where she seemed to have maintained her original characterization. Sweeping the whole thing under the rug was the best course of action to take after all. The reason this entire thing became an issue to begin with was due to a lack of communication between the three parties of artist, writer, and editor. It really shows how important it is for all of them to be on the same page when it comes to manga creation. It certainly didn't help that the three of them were working in their own separate studios either. In the end, poor old Yukime was merely a collateral victim, caught in the crossfire and pushed around by powers beyond her control, all for the sake of the business. This entire situation would finally be addressed in the volume release of Nube, which included a supplementary chapter about Yukime that served to clear the air for all the confused readers out there once and for all. With that, the anime adaptation of Nube could go full throttle. The 128th chapter, titled The Sad Past of Zashiki Warashi, would coincide with the first episode's release date, the ever-so-cursed date of the 13th of April 1996. Makura was bursting at the seams with excitement when he saw the show make it to air. So much so that he threw a huge party and got absolutely plastered. Okano sat on his knees, completely glued to the screen, watching it with his family. Chapter 122 always stood out to me as quite weird when put beside everything else, mostly because it tries to insert Kyoko as a potential love interest for Nube. And well, that's pretty messed up. Especially since it had already been established that she had feelings for Hiroshi by that point. They actually continued pushing this idea for a while, like in chapter 193, when it was revealed that Nube and Kyoko were connected in previous lives too, like one where Kyoko was a puppy and Nube owned her. It was around this time that the weird file arc, which had been going since chapter 108, had started to run its course. Makura's next course of action was to focus exclusively on telling character-driven stories, with the goal of further fleshing out the characters' personalities and their relationships, while the weird phenomena around them were put on the back burner. Since the anime had just started airing, this might have been a way to get the viewers interested and attached to the characters if they were to pick up the manga because of it. From that point on, the duo would make an effort to create some sort of synergy between the manga and its anime adaptation. For example, the chapter in which Nube and Tamamo team up for the first time was written to coincide with Tamamo's first appearance in the anime. Reading the chapter, you can really feel it was developed with the anime in mind. Then, they decided to flesh out Nube himself some more. Unlike many other shonen protagonists, Nube didn't exactly have an end goal that he was working towards, which meant that it was time to rectify that. Nube's greatest goal became freeing the spirit of his former teacher, Minako, who is trapped inside his demon hand in order to conceal the power of the demon Baki. Makura and Okano made sure to splice some chapters that would further this storyline here and there, adding some well-needed continuity to Nube's story. This turned out to be an amazing decision, as not only did it tighten Nube's narrative, but it also kept it from getting dull or repetitive with nothing but episodic adventures in its repertoire. It also gives the readers more of a reason to tune in every week, as they would have a storyline to be invested in. Nube's backstory would be enhanced even further with the introduction of his father, Mugenkai Tokiju. Just like Nube, he was also an exorcist, except he would charge exuberant prices for his services, as opposed to doing it out of the kindness of his heart like Nube did. The duo was able to build up an interesting contrast between them, which also added more depth to Nube himself. This stretch of chapters with a strong focus on character development served as perfect complementary material for the then airing anime. This media mix strategy had been a huge success, and it was this success that allowed Nube to expand from TV animation to movies, OVAs, novels, video games, and much more, becoming a mini media empire. Back at the work desk, the duo were preparing to meet their third editor for the first time. Starting from chapter 166 titled Giant Yokai Norikoshi Nudo, this mysterious new editor would enter the scene. There was no deeper reason for the change this time, just a personnel rearrangement over at the editorial department. Mr. Taniguchi had been in charge of Nube for 2.5 years, and it would be fair to say that the manga found its footing and stabilized its popularity under his guidance. to the point where it was even able to get a TV anime. Despite his mishandling of Yukime, Nube wouldn't have survived as long as he did without him. It was time for him to pass the baton to the next editor. Mr. Tani had been in charge of Nube for 2.5 years. Will this newcomer be able to carry the torch and keep Nube afloat, or will everything crumble to dust now that there's no Mr. Tani to keep it all together? Enter Mr. Muda. Something we have seen previously was how the story of Nube would adapt to reflect the interests of whichever editor was in charge. Such as how the story became more of a romantic comedy with lots of eroticism sprinkled in. During the initial change from Sasaki to Tani, the changes this time would tip the scales in the complete opposite side of the spectrum, and Nube would be injected with a jet stream of manliness. Mr. Muda used to be part of his college rugby team, as well as being the editor of Akira Miyashita on Sakigake Otokojuku before he took charge of Nube. Simply put, he was a man's man. Perhaps that was also why there's a significant absence of ecchi elements during this part of the manga. Unlike Taniguchi, he wasn't fond of fanservice. The masculinity of Nube's stories had increased tenfold under Mr. Muda. Something which becomes apparent when you observe the increase in male characters introduced in the story during his reign. You've got Old Man Akashitani, Yamako, Plague God, Kaoru Kitamura, and Ryugu Doji, just to name a few. This was in stark contrast to the characters introduced during Tani's tenure, who were mostly women. One might find it strange how much an editor can influence the course of the story beyond their assigned tasks of polishing up an author's drafts and giving them advice on what to do or not to do. Makura says that since the editor in charge will be the first reader of any given chapter, he subconsciously adapts the story to suit said editor's preferences. Well, he was also worried that his stories might get rejected if they don't appeal enough to the editor. Some writers will fight tooth and nail to have their visions unaltered, keeping true to themselves, regardless of what the editor in charge might have to say about it. But Okano says they weren't so picky about it. They were too weak-minded for that, as he jokingly put it. Thus, Nube would launch its new overarching storyline, dubbed the Hobby Arc, and it started as soon as the Weird File arc had wrapped up. At this point, the duo felt as if they had exhausted the well of stories regarding all major yokai and supernatural phenomena. So it was time to head in a completely different direction. For example, the story in chapter 169, titled The Last Sticker, was based around the Purikura, a type of camera that was becoming popular at the time. The chapter would see a bunch of people get possessed by spirits after taking pictures with the Purikura, and their souls were transferred into stickers. The Hobby Arc would see Nube take advantage of whatever games, toys, or gadgets were becoming popular with children at the time, and combine them with the manga's usual flavor of demons, spirits, and yokai, a blend which made for some very unique, high-concept stories. This was a winning formula and an absolute hit with the reader base. Turns out that this new arc was less so a change of course, but rather a broadening of horizons in regards to the kinds of stories Nube was able to tell. Makura was able to stretch his artistic chops even further. He would say that manga is like a mirror. It reflects the trends and social conditions of the time. It's impossible to understand every single reference unless you lived in that time period yourself. And he feels as if the atmosphere of a specific time period can be captured within a manga. For example, Nube's distinctive eyebrows were based on those of then current Prime Minister Murayama, and he would often get teased about them by his students, much to his dismay. This might be me imagining things, but I also noticed Nube's eyebrows growing bigger and bigger over the course of the manga. It would also reflect the trends of the time, such as Pokemon, Tamagotchi, and the aforementioned Purikura. There was also the Halle Bob Comet of 1997 and a chapter paying homage to the game Princess Maker. You can even see the way technology advances from 16-bit to the 32-bit era during the course of the manga. Even the advent of personal computers and the internet gets its time in the spotlight. There was also a time when the art of the manga itself tried to incorporate the most advanced 3D rendering technology of the time. Okano really loved playing around with 3D rendering at one point during the manga. Even I have a soft spot for this sort of early plastic-looking era of CG. Just look at this PS1 survival horror game looking render of Nube. It's a vibe. Although, in the chapter where Kyoko gets sent to the dark alternate future, they're still using VHS tapes. Maybe that was the good timeline after all. Izuna as a character is particularly influenced by trends. During her first appearance, she spoke normally, but then, when she returned in a later chapter, she was in full-on Kogyaru dialect mode, swinging slang like Cho Beriba around. She was also seen using a pager during her first appearance, but after that she had a flip phone. If you follow Izuna throughout her appearances in the manga, you can see the evolution in girls' fashion and technology in real time. Despite reflecting the trends of the time, Nube still has a very classic feel to it. Like the best 70s manga that somehow came out in the 90s. Even some of the things it references like Tetsujin 28 and Chibi Maruko-chan were quite old for the time. The duo did mention their love for Go Nagai, and well, the Devilman influence is all over the place. That's actually what led to me discovering and reading the manga in the first place. I needed something to scratch that Devilman itch, and Nube looked like the next best thing. Of course, I have to shout out this Gao Gaiga reference in chapter 244 too. During the chapter featuring the clam wife yokai who falls for Hiroshi and starts cooking for him, Hiroshi's reaction to her cooking was so intense that he ended up growing into a giant and almost wrecking the entire school. This is most likely a parody of people's exaggerated reactions to Ajiko's cooking in the anime adaptation of Mr. Ajiko. After eating delicious food, even Ajiko himself would fire beams from his mouth, destroy entire buildings, and go absolutely feral. There are lots of bizarre, historical, and cultural facts I learned from Nube. Like what an uma is, or how pea soup was an actual thing women cooked for their lovers during the Edo period. If you don't believe me, please look it up. Nube would often parody other contemporary Jump manga, such as Sexy Commando Gaiden, Ultimate Hentai Kamen, Rurouni Kenshin, and Makuhari. In particular, the way they parodied the manga psychological investigator Aoi Kusanagi was so well done to the point where the author thought they were making fun of him. The duo were quite fond of Makuhari, and they wanted to pay homage to it in the story of Nube. Now, there's a scene where the boys are reading previews for the next issue of Jump, and are all excited for next week's developments. Kyoko doesn't buy it at all though. She murmurs, "I'm deceived every week by the previews in Jump." This might seem like a throwaway gag at first, but back in those days, Jump previews would often include content that didn't exist or promises of some sort of super developments that wouldn't come to be. They were all written in a very matter-of-fact manner too, but it was either an elaborate inside joke between the Jump editors or a way to clickbait young children into buying the magazine. I'll leave it up to you. The manliest and most hot-blooded story to come out of Mr. Muda's era has to be hands down the two-parter titled Nube and Yukime, The Final Settlement of Love, spanning chapters 170 and 171. It was the long-awaited climax between Nube and Yukime's will-they-won't-they romance, as well as the culmination of the familial feud between Nube and his father, which had been bubbling on in the background for quite a while. Well, Nube's father only made his first appearance in chapter 150, so in reality it had only been around 3 months, but still, it's not that far behind Yamaoka and Yuyama from Oishimbo, who had been feuding for more than 25 years since the start of the manga. The two-parter would conclude with the untimely passing of Nube's father, as he would sacrifice himself for Nube and Yukime's sake in a final act of redemption, despite what he initially thought of their romance. With his passing, Nube and Yukime's relationship, which had been wavering for a while, would become official. After so many trials and tribulations, justice had finally been served for Yukime. She won. Nube and her were now a loving couple. Everything was alright in the world. At least one would hope. Love is transcendent. With Nube and Yukime acting as the leading couple of the manga, being definitive proof that it can go even beyond one species. This would naturally mean that there would be more human and yokai couples featured in the manga. The first example of this would come in the form of Mami Sensei, a Western-style witch who served as another rival for Nube, and her demon boy toy, Bebel Bubu. Mami Sensei would use black magic to summon Bebel Bubu and make a contract with him. And that's how she finds out that he's actually quite shy and has no luck with women. The two of them quickly develop into a girl boss and male wife couple. It was a relationship that seemed to be a setup for disaster, but surprisingly enough, the two of them lasted until the end of the manga. Not only that, but they would even have a child, as confirmed by the bunko edition of the manga. Next up is the Onago and the Otaku. A modern Beauty and the Beast, if you will. The Onago has the power to drive her possessed partner away through humidity, but since the Otaku is very filthy in his daily life, her dampness means nothing to him. He was actually quite excited to be possessed by what he deemed as a cute girl. It had soon gotten to the point where the Onago was desperately begging Nube to pull the possessed man off her, but in the end, in an unexpected act of manliness from the Otaku, she would end up falling for him, and they continued to be happily bound to each other. Or as she would put it, I'm an Onago after all. I'll hunt him for the rest of my life, even if it takes me decades to kill him, she'd say with a wry smile. What a tsundere ghost, but Nube wished them well regardless. Let us pull back the curtains on one of the weirder couples in the manga. The succubus and the bukudan. It's quite the contrast between the beautiful succubus and this ridiculously ugly guy. The two of them would have a child, and luckily for her, she would inherit most of her mother's genes. Like we've seen with Mami Sensei and Bebe Bubu's child, the child of a human and a yokai couple is more likely to take after the yokai rather than the human. The succubus chapter was really ahead of its time in the way it tackled some gender-related issues. Their parents tried to integrate them into Nube's class, but the succubus child doesn't really have their own concrete identity. They tried being a boy and a girl, but they still felt like they didn't fit in anywhere. So by the end of the chapter, they're like, well, I'm just gonna do my own thing and be my own person. Which I think is a potent message to send, especially for the time. Nube and Yukime's, child resembled both of them in equal amounts, but that was only because Nube is part yokai himself due to his demon hand. Chapter 152 would see the debut of an underrated antagonist for Yukime, a fellow snow woman by the name of Tsurara. She had an awesome design and a cool power set, but sadly, they never did anything more with her past this. Makura and Okano would soon find out that Nube and Yukime's relationship came at a steep price. The chapter following this two-parter, chapter 172, titled Easy O-Ring Anywhere, fell prey to the classic Nube jinx of the chapter following a dramatic one will always tank the rankings. Not only that, but around this time, the anime had just finished airing. It ran for one consecutive year, spanning 49 episodes. Apparently, if the viewer ratings had exceeded their expectations, Toei would have been open to extending its run, but alas, that was not the case. The anime took stories from the first 100 chapters of the manga, while the sequel OVAs would spin off in their own direction, as most Toei anime tend to do after a certain point. Nube never reached the ratings that would have turned it into a massive social phenomenon like Yu Yu Hakusho or Slam Dunk beforehand, both of which being absolute ratings juggernauts when they first aired. Merchandise sales didn't do too hot either, but it's not like there were many Nube toys made to begin with. There was, however, a rubber demon hand, like those Hulk fist toys from the early 2000s. But even that wasn't good enough to salvage the sales. I guess it would have been hard to market something like that to kids, but I know I would have snatched one for sure. The real reason there wasn't much Nube merchandise out there was because Bandai, the company responsible for producing it, was in the middle of a merger with Sega at the time. This meant that they weren't in a position to aggressively market Nube's merch the way they should have. You could say at this point bad luck and bad timing were typical of Nube. Regardless, since the anime has wrapped up and you're familiar with Bakuman, then you're aware that manga that have been adapted into anime tend to lose popularity once the anime ends. Makura and Okano needed some countermeasures to keep Nube from going under, and they needed them fast. This desperate situation spurred Makura to come up with chapter 185, titled The Rescue. It was a chapter in which Nube went on an action hero type mission in order to rescue his students, who had been kidnapped after getting caught up in a bank robbery. It was a chapter that really stood out from the rest. Nube, who had mostly been fighting against spirits and demons up until that point, went up against real human opponents. Makura would say the structure of the chapter was inspired by the movie Die Hard. This chapter would act as a declaration that the duo were ready to completely leave their comfort zone and bring Nube places he'd never been before. They needed to do all they could to survive. Makura was convinced that if they could find a chapter that would be a hit during this period of experimentation, then that would be the breakthrough they so desperately needed. Unfortunately, nothing stood out to the readers, much to his dismay, making the strategy obsolete. There was no time to give up, however. So next, Makura thought about trying an anthology type chapter. Another first for the manga. That's how we got chapter 186, titled The Story We Couldn't Publish Because It Was Too Scary. With such a bold title, the readers' expectations were raised to an all-time high regarding the sort of horrific content they would expect to find within its pages. These expectations were crushed instantly as they found out the chapter was full of toilet humor and other mundane happenings. The readers were essentially baited into reading the chapter, and they did not take kindly to this at all, calling it a literal shitty chapter. This was the second time Nube had a dud chapter since the anime ended. The manga's wheels keep spinning, but are they spinning in place? Makura's last resort was ditching all the experimentation and doing a classic Nube story once again. This brought about chapter 187, titled Ryū Doji. It was a straightforward tale based on a popular Japanese folktale. This seemed to be right in Makura's ballpark as a storyteller. Ryū Doji told the story of an actress who used to be rather prominent but was now on the decline. She wants to use the power of the titular yokai to regain her popularity. The story could almost be interpreted as a reflection of the manga itself at that point in time. Then again, I could be reading too much into it. Perhaps Makura was subconsciously pulling from his real-life situation when writing the chapter. Anyway, the chapter would see the tragic tale of Ochibe Yuko and Ryū Doji. Yuko regained her fame thanks to Doji and was only getting wealthier and prettier, while Doji was becoming uglier and more decrepit. as he kept fulfilling people's wishes. Even so, Yuko realized that in the end, all the wealth and fame could never replace her love with Doji. And so she returns it all, and the couple is reunited. Despite the rocky relationship, the two of them still made it to a happy ending, and they even got married. The most ironic part of all is that, despite how a manga's popularity tends to plummet once the anime goes off the air, from the statistics that are out there, it seems this didn't apply to Nube at all. It wasn't even as if the anime was cancelled or anything. It simply ran its year-long course. Makura seemed to have gotten extremely paranoid and went on this wild experimentation phase over nothing in the end, which is pretty funny but understandable nonetheless. Their trial and error was also a trial and error in and of itself after all. Okano claims that they were simply too horrified at the time, and they couldn't take any chances. Many laughs and tears were had, and everything wrapped up with a happy ending for Doji and Yuko. This was akin to the golden formula the duo abided by while the anime was being broadcast as well. This chapter did decently well with the readers, and as a result of that, they decided that it would be a safer bet to stick to what they've been doing up until now, rather than trying new things, at least for a while. Keeping the ball rolling, the next chapter, titled Namake Yokai Himamushi Irimichi, would introduce a new character, Noriko Nakajima, who was an instant hit with the readers. She filled the role of being the regular girly girl in Nube's class, which was a much needed addition. Considering the chaotic natures of Kyoko and Miki, this also made her a prime victim for spirits and yokai to pick on. Although, during the chapter in which Miki acquires an item that allows her to see her classmates' true feelings whenever it is attached to them, she is amazed to find out Noriko's true feelings are extremely dark and negative, which is very far removed from her usual self. This scene might seem like another throwaway gag at first, but it would come to define Noriko's characterization moving forward. Such as when she was possessed by the pouch fairy, or having her hair cut by Kamikiri, which altered her personality. It's something you would be tempted to pass off as inconsistent characterization at first, but since the item Miki possessed makes you reveal what you really think, that means Noriko was acting completely truthfully in all those other chapters too. In the past, there had been glimpses of Noriko being somewhat black-hearted, but nothing was ever confirmed. But this story confirms, without a shadow of a doubt, that Noriko is a very black-hearted person. With 2 hits in a row, Nube had proved that it still had some gas left in its tank after all. It's also worth noting that the manga had shed its horror roots completely at this point in time. Most of the stories it opted for were now gag, school, or romantic comedy oriented. This was due to horror being on the decline at that point in time. It was a harsh realization for the duo, since horror stories had been their bread and butter since the very start. They were always able to get out of a tight spot by doing yet another horror tale. It was how they made a name for themselves to begin with. Would they even be able to survive without their ultimate weapon? With heavy hearts, the two of them knew they had to search for a new gimmick they could call their own. People enjoyed the cute, heartwarming slice-of-life type stories they were doing up until now, but that's because they only did them every once in a while. This couldn't become their main thing. If they kept doing them all the time, people would grow tired of them. Out of fear of getting stuck in this rut, Makura really scrambled his brain for any new development, or even new characters that would spice up the story. Makura and Okano would even start exploring new business ventures at one point. Nube was no stranger to ecchi-oriented chapters, but the 214th chapter, titled Harenchi Yokai Konaki Jiji, was especially erotic. even by Nube standards. In the making of section, the duo would talk passionately about the concept of eroticism. Makura would say that these days, there are fewer sexually explicit manga that children can enjoy, featuring the kind of sex that is cheerful and enjoyable. They would also say that some of the drawings in Nube are on the verge of being ero manga, and they definitely wouldn't have gotten away with them in this day and age. You can't talk about Nube without addressing its prominent ecchi elements, making it akin to many exploitation horror movies of yore. Makura claims to be an avid reader of Go Nagai, so he sees ecchi scenes as a natural part of the story, as well as a good way to take a break from all the slashing. Okano would go on to add that there is a deeper reason behind the rampant portrayal of eroticism in Nube. You see, it is said that ghosts are averse to eroticism. It's the yin to their yang, as he put it, which means that sexually explicit content can be expected to ward off evil. And that makes it a necessary precaution for a manga like Nube. Makura would say that he included ecchi scenes in the manga specifically for the safety of the readers. What a noble man, always putting the readers first. With that thought in mind, they actually went to the editorial department one day to make a pitch. The time was ripe for children to enjoy Harenchi Jump, a comprehensive sex manga magazine aimed at children. You can imagine the editorial department would laugh this proposal off, but they didn't see it as a joke at all. Our duo was deathly serious about it. They wanted to put together a team of ragtag erotic manga artists who had mastered their craft, such as Kentaro Yabuki of To Love Ru fame, Kazushi Hagiwara of Bastard, and Masakazu Katsura of DNA Squared, as the core creative team of the magazine. Their next goal would be to nurture younger writers and artists who would build the next generation of shonen erotica, taking the world by storm. They wanted it to be a wholesome sex manga magazine first and foremost. Not the gritty kind of erotica you see all over the internet these days. The idea was to cultivate a cheerful and enjoyable sex culture in Japan, helping youths realize that it is a natural part of life. A message especially poignant in the modern age with birth rates on the decline. The duo had always been very outspoken against censorship in manga, even fighting for and protecting To Love Ru during its run. Needless to say, their dream of Harenchi Jump never left its conceptual phase, and perhaps that is for the best in the long run. Although, I'm sure that if Shinzo Abe had been in the office back then, they would have seen their dream realized at the snap of a finger. Perv on, you glorious bastards. While doing research for this video, I even stumbled upon an article where a guy who grew up with the manga was having a talk about men's breast size preferences with a female coworker, and they came to the conclusion that Nube ended up influencing an entire generation of boys' breast preferences, with all the voluptuous girls it featured, as well as the glorification of big breasts from characters like Miki. It cracked me up really hard, so I had to squeeze it in somewhere. In this sense, the manga is not an uncritical glorification of big tits, as it is typical of the plot that a sexy woman's physical attractiveness is outweighed by the power of love, but the message that a woman without big tits is less physically attractive comes through strongly. Children who are addicted to Nube may have come to value big tits as something that men want. Following that, Makura tried shaking up the love triangle of Nube with an unexpected new development. During the arc spanning chapters 215 through 217, Ritsuko and Minako would perform the fusion dance to create Ritsunako Sensei. Makura thought this would breathe new life into the romantic comedy storyline, which had grown quite stale by that point. You might have noticed that Ritsuko and Minako had very similar faces to begin with, And it wasn't just because they looked like they were drawn by Shotaro Ishinomori. This might have been a way to explain Nube's one-sided love towards Ritsuko at the start of the manga, since she reminded him of his beloved teacher. However, Makura didn't write the story with that idea in mind at all. When Okano first designed Minako, he intentionally made her look like Ritsuko for this exact thematic purpose. But from Makura's point of view, a man doesn't need a specific reason to be in love with a woman. In fact, he didn't even realize Minako was supposed to look like Ritsuko. This was one case where the storyline was driven purely by Okano's art. It's interesting how this sort of thing can happen even in stories featuring a writer and artist duo. During a 30th anniversary Q&A, a fan asked Okano whether Ritsuko was modeled off anyone in particular. Okano would say that Makura wanted to base her off singer Miki Imai, and her name was also going to be Mrs. Imai. But her first name was too similar to Miki Hosokawa from Nube's class, so they had to come up with something else. It was then that an assistant told Okano to use her name, or she'll leave the office for good. Thus, the Ritsuko everyone knows came into being. When Asami saw this, she thought Okano was joking around. Incidentally, a lot of background characters in Nube were designed by Asami. Okano would develop quite a bit as an artist during Nube's run. He would start doing more expressive faces, better panel flow, and most important of all, better gore. He would also say that Nube is his favorite character to draw, and one of the few characters he can draw perfectly from memory. He is also too embarrassed to draw female characters in public. Since he didn't have much success when experimenting with new developments, the next best thing was introducing a new character. But Makura knew he couldn't simply drop a new main character on the readers out of the blue like that. Introducing a new main character this late into a manga's run was no easy task. He also had to make sure the new character's role in the story didn't contradict any of the existing ones. There'd be no novelty to it otherwise. Not only that, but the other characters would be rendered redundant. With all that in mind, does such a convenient character that could revitalize the manga and get the duo out of this funk they seem to be stuck in even exist? Well, as a matter of fact, he does, but not in the way that you might think. During some of the past chapters, Makura had been playing with the concept of an elementary school version of Nube, in which he transforms using the Yojin no Jutsu in order to give his students a helping hand without making it seem like he's babying them or anything. This elementary school disguise was a way for him to be one of the kids, while also maintaining his role as a mentor. Turns out this miraculous new character they had been clamoring for was right under their noses all along. This turned the original idea Makura had for Nube on its head, namely an adult character with a child's mind. By making him a child with the mind of an adult, this is the tale of Akira Hinokami. Just as they had hoped for, Akira Hinokami was both an innovative concept but also did not conflict with any of the existing characters. Making the deal even sweeter, he could also play the role of the main character since, well, he literally was the main character. This was the breakthrough they needed. What's more is that by inserting himself as one of the kids, Nube was able to nurture new, more personal bonds with his students, including ones he had been somewhat distant with in his base form. It was something he simply couldn't do as an adult. This created a dichotomy between the two sides of Nube, which further helped differentiate them as separate personas with their own unique role in the story. Akira Hinokami really was a useful character. Rather, as Okano would put it, easy to use and easy to store. Popular and versatile to draw for too. Definitely worth the bang for your buck. Makura would add, I would totally buy one for my family. All jokes aside, the creation of Akira Hinokami would most certainly lift a weight off the duo's shoulders. Makura would claim they now had one more trump card they could make use of whenever they were in trouble, which was a very apt way to put it. Since we're on the topic of Akira Hinokami, I can't go without mentioning the extremely cursed chapter 213, where Nube is trapped in his astral projection form and he accidentally turns Yukime into a Shotakon. It's hard to explain. Some chapters are pure, unadulterated fetish content. Like chapter 220, in which Izuna gets a virgin pregnancy from a demon. And by the end of the chapter, the demon baby starts belly hopping to every woman in town. An average day in the world of Nube, I guess. They would need all the trump cards they could get, because soon after, Nube would change editors for the third time. Starting from chapter 199, Mr. Muda, who had been in charge of the manga up until that point, would be replaced by Mr. Suda, a newcomer who had only been with Jump for 6 months. You know the drill by now. Nube changes its style to accommodate whoever is in charge. With that in mind, what sort of changes will the fresh new face on the block, Mr. Suda, bring to the manga? This time, it all started with a change in the general atmosphere of the manga, as well as the target demographic it aimed for being lowered dramatically. The 199th chapter was a spoof on Pokemon, a franchise which had taken the world by storm at the time. It would see the kids competing in Pokemon-like battles, using gadgets given to them by the monks of Domori Temple. The chapter's punchline would see Nube himself come out of a gachapon. It's pretty wacky. Mr. Suda is said to have come up with it himself. Makura would say he was amazed by the guy's unbelievable creativity. That's the power of youth for ya. It was perhaps also due to Mr. Suda's influence that the female roster would once again increase, as well as the atmosphere becoming more lighthearted overall. The ecchi elements, which had been restrained during Mr. Muda's tenure, had made a full-force comeback. This brought the manga closer to the way it was during Mr. Tani's era. As a matter of fact, the stories would become even more erotic than they were during that time. That's also the power of youth for ya. With Mr. Suda at the helm, the manga would see its most radical shift yet. Makura could no longer avoid the inevitable. The manga had at last reached the point where it turned into a full-fledged battle manga with the introduction of the Zeki arc. Things shift into gear when Zeki, the younger brother of Baki, the demon sealed inside Nube's hand by Minako all those years ago, arrives in Domori Park. Since Baki had been missing for quite some time, he figured out something must have happened to him, and he wants to see what exactly went on in the human world. The arrival of Zeki brought a dramatic power creep alongside it. Spiritual power is like the Nube equivalent to power levels. It was kinda like when the Saiyans arrived on Earth for the first time in the pages of Dragon Ball. There was also a looming sense of dread permeating the chapter, one the likes of which we had never seen before in the manga. The storyline would unravel itself across 6 chapters, spanning over a month and a half. This made it the longest running storyline since the infamously cursed 5-chapter Tamamo arc at the very start of the manga. Since that initial arc was so catastrophic, the duo was still concerned that full-length story arcs simply won't do well at all. However, all of their worries were washed away once they saw the reader polls for the first chapter. It was a roaring success. Readers found it exciting to see all the popular characters coming together in order to confront an even bigger threat. It was a classic hot-blooded battle shonen arc, which turned a lot of heads towards the manga for the very first time. And as a result of that, the manga was able to attract a brand new following, composed of boys who love battles, also known as the main readership of Jump at the time. By the end of this arc, Nube was making its way to the top of the rankings once again. The manga hadn't seen such a stark increase in popularity since Nube and Yukime became a couple all the way back in chapter 171. This also marked the first time characters such as Yukime, Tamamo, Izuna, and Hayami first met and interacted with each other. Being able to weave relationships between these characters also served to make it easier to write stories for them in the future. This arc seems to have brought about nothing but good things for the manga. But as we've come to learn, it's never all sunshine and roses in the ghastly world of Nube. Despite being such a great success, the Zeki arc brought upon some unexpected pitfalls the duo could have never foreseen. They had to address a dilemma that had been plaguing them since the very start of the manga. Namely, having to decide whether they were going to stick to battle arcs or episodic arcs from then on. Even though the Zeki arc had propelled Nube to new heights, seemingly overnight, it all plummeted just as fast the moment the subsequent chapters were published. At this point, you could probably guess why. Nube fell prey to its own jinx of following a serious chapter with a silly one, which always tanks the rankings without fail. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, however. It made the duo realize there was a fundamental problem at play. So they stepped back and re-evaluated their approach to storytelling altogether. Nube had always had a relaxed approach to its stories. Its setting would lend itself well to episodic tales without ever having the need to expand them beyond their initial scope. Loyal readers had grown accustomed to this formula, and they felt alienated by the battle manga approach of the Zeki arc. Makura would say that writing battle arcs became too much fun for him, while the episodic stories were beginning to lose their luster. This arc opened a Pandora's box for the manga. Still, Makura was reluctant to turn Nube into a full-time battle manga. He didn't want to alienate his entire reader base, which had grown fond of Nube's cozy episodic mishaps. That turned out to be the best decision to take, as he would soon find out. You see, this new reader base Nube had garnered in the wake of the Zeki arc wasn't interested in Nube as a manga in particular, but rather the idea of it being a battle manga, or ichigen as they put it. It goes without saying that if you want your manga to do well in the rankings, you need to appease these types of readers as well. But Makura saw the value in maintaining his most loyal readers who've been supporting Nube through thick and thin. It would have been nothing short of self-destructive to cut them off. Our duo was now placed at a crossroads created by the way the jump system tends to operate. They could either go all in on the battles and lift their manga to new heights, or continue to do episodic stories like they've been doing and maintain their cult following. The path they shall choose will decide the ultimate fate of Nube. It all lingers on this one singular decision. So, in the end, what will it be? Makura would simply smile in the face of this decision and proudly exclaim, "I'm taking both paths." But how would he even manage to do something like that? Was such an option even possible for him? Turns out, Makura had all the reasons in the world to fuel his confidence. Believe it or not, he might have stumbled upon a glitch in the system, a chink in the seemingly unbreakable armor of the machine that is Jump. You see, once every 3 months, the authors of each manga running in the magazine are invited to a meeting with the editorial staff. It's during this meeting that the fate of each series is ultimately decided. The editorial staff either allows it to go on or cancels it by the end of the meeting. They use the data from the Jump rankings as a reference for this process, which seems reasonable. But this data is not taken from the manga's lifetime rankings. They merely use the data from the last couple of weeks before the meeting. In other words, if the manga managed to go on a streak of good rankings for a couple of weeks, then it gets to see another day, no matter how horribly it might have performed up until that point. This realization sparked something inside Makura. It activated all of his almonds at once. Makura immediately went to write more battle arcs, but he only ever did so in the weeks prior to the meetings. That way, he could still do the traditional episodic Nube stories the rest of the time. With this strategy, Nube would always rank high right before the meeting, making it essentially non-cancelable. It was an actual 4D chess master plan on Makura's part. He finally cracked the code. Like this, he could get away with writing literally anything he wanted in the manga. Well, as long as he made sure to put out a quick battle arc once every couple of months. It was how we got chapters such as the 221st one, titled Yokai Painter Toriyama Seiken, a special chapter focusing on the titular yokai painter, who actually existed in the Edo period. The characters of Nube were all reimagined for the Edo period. This kind of storytelling was often seen in anime and manga of the 90s. Eventually, if a series runs long enough, usually more than 4 cores, you can bet it'll have an Edo period episode ready to go. That's something you can even see nowadays with the Samurai Yakuza games, following the same structure we see here. It's a nice change of pace, all things considered, keeping it fresh whenever the story gets too monotone. Soon after that, Makura would follow the Zeki arc, with the second battle arc of the manga, titled Formation, the Domori Youth Spiritual Assault Association, starting in chapter 224. This arc would see Nube and Tamamo get petrified by its main antagonist, leaving the children to go on a rescue mission where they fully fend for themselves for the very first time. While Nube and Tamamo can only hold down the fort using their astral projection forms. There's also this crazy looking guy who uses evil video games to kill people. That's not the important part though. He's just a vehicle to let Nube students have their time in the limelight. During this arc, each one of the main students demonstrates the power of the heart, which shows how much they have grown, and they receive cool Saint Seiya-esque weapons and armor, in correspondence with their personalities and virtues. Hiroshi and Kyoko were the main hero and heroine respectively among the students, so their powers manifested in a royal ironclad expression of courage and friendship. Makoto was kindness, and he received a peaceful weapon that pacified yokai by making them nostalgic. Much like Pop in the Dragon Quest Dino Daiboken, Katsuya believes he doesn't possess any special virtue because his mind isn't strong enough, so he ends up running away from it all. Eventually, he returned to save everyone when they needed him the most, showing his sense of responsibility. In turn, granting him an awesome motorcycle weapon. As for Miki, well, she received the virtue of vanity, which makes for a hilarious contrast with all the honorable attributes the others possessed. She just gets an ancient steel weapon to whack yokai on the head with. There's no lesson attached to it or anything. It's very on brand for Miki's character, always protecting her reputation, even when she's in a pinch. That's the definition of having your cake and eating it too. Makura managed to carve his own path in the magazine, even with all odds stacked against him. Despite not having the pedigree of a Yu Yu Hakusho or a Slam Dunk, Nube had found a way to survive among them. This entire struggle, this unwavering will to survive, would grant Nube one more year in the magazine. The duo would keep this blend of battle and episodic arcs going for a while, and everything seemed to be working as intended. Once they became comfortable enough, they knew they had to step it up a notch in order to avoid stagnation. Everything they had been building up until that point would culminate in the pages of the 239th chapter, titled The Angel of Death. This chapter would see Nube being sentenced to death in exactly 24 hours by the titular Angel of Death. His actions during those 24 hours are depicted with utmost care, giving a sense of gravitas and realism to it all. It was the first time that such a profound psychological portrayal of Nube himself had been depicted in the manga. This chapter is essentially one long introspective look into his psyche. Nube, who up until that point had always performed his exorcisms pro bono, starts using his talent to make money for the very first time, as we see him revel in supreme luxury and hedonism. He then goes on to leave a heartfelt message to every important person in his life, The meticulous amount of detail in every message serves to gradually get the readers feeling more and more uneasy. I'm sure readers were used to fake out deaths. If they had been reading the magazine for a significant amount of time, surely Nube would find a way to cheat death in some way and come out on top like he always does. But then, when all is said and done, it actually happens. Meisuke Nueno is dead. Truth be told, by that point in time, it had become a staple of the magazine to kill off your main character at least once. It was only a matter of time before Nube got around to it as well. What makes his death stand out, however, is that it doesn't happen in battle or during some big dramatic and emotional moment. Instead, it was a spur-of-the-moment occurrence while he went on about his daily life. The fact that the main character could die in the midst of a regular episodic chapter gave the whole thing a sense of realism, which was simply unprecedented. Even this late into the run, the duo were still looking for ways to outdo themselves, reinventing the wheel. This story was an absolute Hail Mary. If Nube had died in battle instead, I don't think it would have left as huge of a splash in the magazine. The real struggle now was finding a way to follow it up. That's where the 240th chapter, titled Agio-san, comes into play. It's a chapter which hits you in the face the moment you start reading it, by having its opening scene be Nube's very real funeral. They even made sure to depict his cremation, as if to make sure the readers are aware that Nube was really gone. Well, also because it wasn't unusual for jump characters to die and then randomly come back to life. Shout out to Sakigake Otokojuku whenever it included dead characters in crowd shots. Like, who invited you here, man? While not on the same level, even Nube had done it once before, by reviving Yukime out of the blue. The thoroughness with which Makura portrays the funeral service is supposed to instill a sense of loss in the readers. He wants them to feel the emptiness created by Nube's demise. And it's during this demise that the titular Agio-san decides to make his move, attacking the now vulnerable students. With no one left to take Nube's place, it's up to Tamamo and Yukime to step up as the new protectors, which really highlights how much they had grown as characters, considering how antagonistic and, well, borderline psychotic they were during their first few appearances. Even so, the situation was looking as desperate as ever, without Nube there to exercise the spirit like he always did. And in a moment of complete hopelessness, Hiroshi exclaims that Nube really is gone, and he will never ever be able to help them again. Agio-san possesses the unique ability of turning every true statement someone makes into a lie. The earlier statement made by Hiroshi makes Agio-san's abilities subconsciously kick in. Thus, the death of Nube is turned into a lie, and the man himself makes his triumphant return, as he was able to cheat death itself in the end. I'm sure you guys probably caught on that this resurrection was always a matter of time, but Makura still found an unexpected way to go about it. This two-parter ended up being extremely well received, particularly the first part. It even made people acknowledge Makura's writing capabilities for the first time, and he would receive many accolades around this time. Even this late into its run, this arc served to prove that Nube still had some worthwhile stories to tell. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You know how the jinx goes, the next chapter after a dramatic one and all that. And it's not like this was any kind of dramatic chapter. It was the most dramatic one yet. You can't get much more extreme than killing your main character, burying him, and then bringing him back to life. If anything, this would amplify the effect of the jinx tenfold. Makura knew he had to come up with the countermeasure of a lifetime, or else Nube wouldn't be the only dead meat around. Luckily, by this point, after so much trial and error, he was already prepared. His master plan would not only keep the manga alive, but also break the mold of Weekly Shonen Jump itself. And so, the plan? Pennies. Wait, let me explain. It'll make perfect sense. I swear, while Akira Hinokami was fun and all, he didn't have the allure of Nube's iconic Bishoujo poster girls. That's why Makura decided to introduce a brand new character into the cast, one that could rock that gimmick. And rock it she did. This is Minky. She doesn't wear any panties. Look, she's not just some random pantyless girl, she also happens to be one of the most important characters in the entire manga, as she is revealed to be the little sister of Zeki, and more importantly, Baki. It was a bold decision, to say the least, to introduce such an important character like this, but it's undeniable that her first appearance left a splash. You see, Minky came to Earth in search of the source of her absolute power, her demon panties, which she seemed to have lost along the way. That's why she uses her demonic powers to strip every character naked. What's more is that she turns all the boys into panties and the girls have to put them on in order to save them. It's for the sake of the plot, I swear. This 3-chapter panty odyssey would be the most fanservice infused story in the entire manga. Makura would say that the previous arc was the most impactful story he had ever written up until that point, and he wanted to see if he could somehow one-up himself. That's when he started thinking, what could possibly be more impactful than the death of Nube? Thinking about it made Makura realize that for a story to be impactful, it doesn't necessarily need to be dramatic. There are all kinds of impacts. So, when coming up with the Minky arc, his goal shifted to wanting to create the story with the greatest erotic impact in the world. And well, it's undeniable that Minky left her mark on the manga. One could argue that the tonal whiplash between the two arcs is nothing short of jarring, but at the same time, that's what makes the story of Nube so unique. It's a multi-layered work of many facets, whether it's horror, comedy, ecchi, romance, or drama. Nube can blend them all in some way. It's this free flow approach that makes Nube such a versatile work. It can be whatever it wants to be and flip itself on a dime. That is ultimately its greatest strength. There aren't a lot of stories out there that can casually shift from a touching story about life and death to singing about demon panties while everyone is running around naked. That's the real power of Nube. It should be no surprise that Minky became ridiculously popular among readers. She became so popular, in fact, that she was incorporated into Nube's class and became a recurring character. She even got her own panty song. I'll leave it up to you guys to come up with a melody for this. Okano would even say that Minky was his favorite female character to draw. And it's no surprise, seeing how creative and elaborate her design is. It does look like something that would be fun to draw. On that panty-powered note, Nube was quickly approaching its 5th anniversary of serialization. And as a celebration, Makura prepared a special chapter, the 249th one, titled Nube's Training. The chapter would once again provide us with a glimpse into Nube's elusive past, except this time, it took place during the time when he was still in training to become a full-fledged exorcist. Before that, we only saw glimpses into Nube's childhood, such as in chapters 236 and 237, where we saw that he dealt with some severe bullying growing up. It's always interesting to try and piece together Nube's past through these brief looks into it that we get. It really had been an incredible journey for Nube to get where he is now. The same could be said about the manga itself. If it weren't for Makura and Okano's incredible intestinal fortitude, Nube would have succumbed to the pressures of Weekly Jump and perished before it would catch flight. Even when the manga faltered through the Tamamo arc, even when the anime ended, they would grit their teeth and carve a path out for themselves. They were always desperate to survive. Nube had more than earned its 5 years of serialization. They were achieved completely through the duo's blood, sweat, and tears. This time, however, they were up against the fiercest enemy of all, the cruel mistress that is time itself. Starting from here, the readership of Nube would steadily dwindle, regardless of what Makura and Okano would do. While the two of them still refused to accept it, there was no escaping the painful realization that perhaps Nube had run its course. There is a certain melancholic feeling to this following stretch of chapters. It's hard to convey into words. It's almost as if the characters themselves became aware that they were nearing the end of the line. It's reminiscent of that sting you feel when you want to return home and there's no longer a home to return to. It made for a very unique reading experience, to say the least. Even in the making of section, at the end of the bunko release, which I had been pulling information from for this video, Makura claims that he doesn't even want to talk or think about these times in Nube's serialization. It must have been a very stressful time in his life. Nube had been his entire life for 5 whole years at this point. You can imagine how difficult it must have been to learn to let go. The 28th volume does not even feature a making of section as a result of this. Still, Makura and Okano weren't about to go down without a fight. They still had the ace up their sleeve, discovered by Makura earlier. And you bet they were going to abuse it until the very end. That's what gave us the Yan Karim arc. It was a rather short arc about a fellow exorcist who wants to steal Nube's demon hand and use it to exterminate all demons. What's more surprising is that he almost succeeds. They must have tried to set him up as another rival for Nube, one who would challenge his morality and show a different side to being an exorcist. Sadly, he would not show up again past this arc, most likely due to time constraints, so I may only speculate about what could have been. There have been multiple antagonists who challenged Nube's morality in regards to whether demons deserve to exist alongside humans. It's an interesting conflict that I wish would have been explored more. Nube believes in redeeming demons and teaching them the right way as a teacher, as we've seen multiple times throughout the manga. It's a quality worthy of a Jump protagonist, but perhaps it's also because he's part demon himself, no matter how small that part may be. Even this action-packed arc wasn't enough to spark reader interest anymore. Jump readers were ready to move on to new stories by then, especially with the advent of Naruto, One Piece, and Hunter x Hunter by 1999, which made Nube seem a little bit like a manga out of time when put side by side with them in the magazine. With such an apocalyptic feeling lingering in the air, Makura knew there was only one thing left to do. Baki's Resurrection would be the title of chapter 262, as it would herald the final battle between Nube and the eldest of the 3 demon brothers, the titular Baki, unleashing the ultimate conflict the manga had been building up to for years at this point. It was time for Nube to achieve his shonen protagonist goal, namely to seal Baki for good and put the spirit of his teacher Minako to rest. This was the long-awaited conclusion to the Demon Hand saga. This was the very last trump card tucked away up Makura's sleeves. It must have been a story arc he saved for desperate situations, when the manga needed it the most. It would be his final attempt to zap some life into the manga and find a way to keep pushing forward. He might have waited a bit too long, as he would soon find out, as it became too little too late to prevent the apocalypse now. Readers found themselves disappointed with how this arc played out. They were expecting some kind of bombastic, climactic battle between Nube and Baki, and what they got was, well, anything but that. Then again, battles were never the duo's forte, hence they had been avoiding them for so long. But reading this arc, you can tell that they really did try their very best to make the action as good as it could be. Personally, I really enjoyed the idea of Baki being a complete goofball with the mind of a child, completely subverting the way he had been portrayed up until that point. Perhaps it's an homage to how Makura wanted to portray Nube himself initially. Either way, it makes it more believable that Baki, the strongest demon in hell, would be able to get sealed away in the first place when you consider his mental impairment. The demon armor Nube gets during their fight is way too cool. Thematically, this is a great final fight for Nube because in the end, he will always refuse to use his demon hand out of hatred, and that is what gives him the edge over his opponents every single time. That's what makes Nube human, and why, no matter how demonic his body might get, he will never cross over to the demon side. In the wake of this bittersweet conclusion, the cancellation of Nube had officially been decided. It all started when Makura and Okano were summoned for an unplanned meeting with Jump Editorial. The moment they walked through the door, the editor-in-chief at the time, Mr. T. Shima, simply smiled in their direction and uttered, "You know, Nube is so boring these days. So, when is it time to call it quits? With its twilight drawing near, we're about to enter Nube's final days. The world of Jump manga was as ruthless as ever. Even a long-running series such as Nube, which had been a staple of the magazine for half a decade, can get mercilessly axed at a moment's notice. Makura kept his composure despite it all, and he still tried to make the best out of this situation, the way he always did during serialization. He would tell the editor-in-chief, "Well, in that case, I'll see you in about 3 months." He thought that would be an adequate time frame to tie up every single loose end and wrap the manga up in a nice, satisfying bow. The editorial department actually agreed with the condition imposed by Makura, and he would go on to express his gratitude for even being granted such an unbelievably good deal. This is the beginning of the end. Since the duo is now aware that Nube is living on borrowed time, they knew they had no more time to waste if they wanted to wrap everything up properly, so they went straight to work. First on the bucket list was, at long last, letting the spirit of Minako rest in peace. Since Nube had already tamed Baki, there was no reason for Minako to use her spiritual power to keep him sealed. That realization brought us one of the most heartwarming chapters in the manga, in which the spirit of the now freed Minako gets to enjoy her last moments together with Nube before ascending to the astral plane. Tamamo's character arc would also reach its climax once he is forced to become a villain once more as a means to survive in the wake of his mortal coil reaching its time limit. Nube tries to get the nine-tailed fox to save his life by sharing one of its souls, but the fox will only agree to it if Nube can survive its intense psychological torture. There's a really great moment here where, even as a vegetable, Tamamo's body jumps in front of Nube to protect him from an attack. He really had become unrecognizable from his first few appearances. In the end, Nube manages to save him, and the two of them had solidified their bond as true bros for life. Much like Tamamo, Minky would also try to study and understand humans after getting redeemed by Nube. She tries to become his little sister since her actual big brother is trapped inside his hand, which leads to loads of hysterical interactions between the two of them. I love that you can see Minky become more human in real time, since unlike Tamamo, she becomes part of the main cast. Izuna's last lesson would be one of responsibility, as she had to take care of her unruly familiar, Gedo. And though they got off to a rocky start, Izuna learns to be patient and train with him. We can see her start caring for someone other than herself for the first time. Then, when Gedo is tragically taken away from her, it gives her a newfound resolve and a sense of maturity that'll carry over into her own manga. Both Izuna and Tamamo learn humility and become a lot more selfless as the story goes on. It's one of the coolest developments to follow. Eventually, Izuna becomes Miki's mentor, and the two of them use Miki's yokai powers to become scam artists and get rich and famous that way. With that settled, the duo's attention would go back onto Nube's students. Graduation day was drawing near, which meant the class would be disbanded, as they would all be placed in different classes at the start of middle school. Kyoko doesn't feel ready to move on. She treasures the irreplaceable bonds she was able to form with her classmates over the past year, and she wants these fun days to go on forever. And so, in the unexpected wrap-up to the School Mysteries arc, Kyoko gets her wish granted by the Cherry Blossom Spirit. Makura really saved the last school mystery until the very end. Obviously, there are more 7 mysteries types of urban legends depending on the region or the school you're in, but it's nice that Nube found exactly 7 of them to cover during its run. While at first she seemed happy to be able to relive all those good times, she soon realized that the bonds between her classmates had also been reset. All the growth they had experienced over the past year had been undone. This made Kyoko realize what she really loved about the class. She loved how much everyone had grown as people, and how they became closer and got to understand each other during the school year, not the idea of the class itself. Those memories, those experiences simply could not be recreated. It's something you only live through once in a lifetime. This little arc packs a beautiful message about learning to move on and let things end. Instead of being stuck in the past all your life, the future will bring you even more unique memories, experiences, and bonds. What is especially interesting about this arc is that, up until that point, the manga operated on what the Japanese call the Sazae-san style, which means it had a sliding timeline. However, this chapter confirms that the entire manga had indeed happened over the span of a single school year. Through the line, a lot has happened over this past year. Despite being an episodic manga with a sliding timeline akin to long-running anime, the relationships between the characters as well as their development did not reset each chapter. Tamamo's backstory would also shift around as a result of this sliding timeline. Despite seeming like an ancient demon, he's only around 400 years old, so the eras he was alive in would change to match the timeline. There might have been a few loops of seasonal stories during the course of the manga, which would most certainly mess with the consistency of it taking place over 1 year, but man, what a packed year it was, huh? In the end, Kyoko learned to move on, while keeping the memories of her classmates and all the fun times they had close in her heart. With that, she was ready to face middle school with her head held high and a smile on her face. You could definitely see this entire arc as a reflection of Makura and Okano's feelings regarding the manga getting cancelled. They too had learned to let go, while treasuring all the good times they had working on Nube, and knowing they could never recreate them or drag the manga out forever. This arc was a swan song for the manga, but one which also symbolized the start of a new journey. For the duo, Nube would embark on a new journey as well, as it was time for him to finally tie the knot and get married to Yukime. You can't end your shonen manga without the obligatory wedding after all. With his students acting as his wingman, Nube succeeds in proposing to Yukime, and the two of them get ready for their wedding. That isn't to say there weren't some issues along the way, like one of Yukime's demon relatives wanting to crash the whole thing. There was also Yukime's plight before the ceremony. I'm a yokai, aren't I? That means I can't officially get married to you by joining a registry. Which meant that Nube and Yukime would not be recognized by law as married, despite their wedding. But as long as the two of them are happy, who cares whether they're recognized by human law or not? It's all a bunch of made up stuff anyway. And well, the other yokai and human couples we've looked at got married too, and they seem pretty happy to me. Look, they even showed up at Nube's wedding. There's Mami Sensei and Bebe Boo Boo, the Onago and the Otaku, and even Ryugu Doji together with Yuko. It's funny how at this point in the story, Nube is so ridiculously powerful, especially after making peace with Baki, that this conflict ends up being a minor inconvenience to him instead. Look at these sweet wings and enhancements he's got now. I almost wish we got to see them used more. The atmosphere of these last two volumes of the manga is something magical. It's like Makura and Okano running one great victory lap. There's that sense of finality in the air. It's that feeling you get after completing a long journey, and you get a moment of peace to take it all in. You don't get that with a lot of long-running manga, oddly enough. Usually the story just ends the moment the main conflict gets wrapped up, which is why I appreciate that we get to see Nube as a married man. After following his relationship with Yukime for so long, the readers have more than earned getting to see them married for as long as possible. Every journey has its destination, however. And for Nube, that would be its 279th chapter, titled Farewell to a Student. Nube had carefully nurtured the growth of his students over an entire school year. He saw them grow into their own, and they even got to save him a couple of times. He was no longer worried about the course of their development. Whether they had to deal with a school or a spiritual issue, he knew they could handle themselves just fine. Nube had nothing left to teach them. This was a sign that he was ready to move on and teach the next generation of students, as any diligent teacher would do. So he asked to be transferred to Kyushu. What follows is an extremely heartfelt farewell between Nube and his class. It's honestly impossible to read this chapter without bursting into tears. This must have been especially true for those who had been following the manga weekly for almost 6 years as it was coming out. It's an absolutely perfect ending, bundled with an important message about growing up and moving on to boot. Just as Nube students are entering a new stage in their lives by going into middle school, Nube was also ready to move on to his next adventure, full of fresh experiences in Kyushu. Farewell to the days of Class 3-5. Farewell, Nube, and in the end, may we remember these glorious memories. Makura and Okano made the ending as clean, clear, and concise as possible, without a single plot thread left dangling in the air. The duo had stuck the landing with flying colors. It's the kind of ending where you wouldn't even have been able to tell the manga was cancelled, unless you knew that beforehand. Those 3 months really did them wonders. It was as close to an amicable end as you could possibly get in Jump. There are so many manga out there that had been serialized for even longer than Nube that weren't able to come to as clean of an ending as it did. In that regard, it was a very fortunate situation. However, it didn't all amount to fortune, but also the desperate struggle of both Makura and Okano. In the afterword of the Bunko edition, Makura would go on to say the following.
As a mangaka, it is true that whenever I wrote a story that wasn't well received, I was extremely depressed. However, when I'm able to overcome this and come up with a new idea which makes the popularity of the story rise, the amount of joy I feel is indescribable. During the serialization of Nube, Okano and I experienced these ups and downs many times, and we became addicted to the feeling.
The serialization process had turned them into thrill-seeking junkies. Reading the making-of segments really puts into perspective how tremendous of an effort this was for both of them. It's something you would have never guessed just by reading the chapters themselves. Knowing all the struggle that went behind them adds so much more to the reading experience of Nube. Once you see just how much blood, sweat, and tears went into the making of it all, it's impossible not to be moved by it at least a little bit. What's interesting to note is that rather than being driven by wanting to create a work of art, Makura became more interested in winning the serialization race, as he was always looking for ways to cheat the system and see the numbers go up. He really was the original gacha player. Reading his testimonies at the back of the books really gives you the feeling of, I'm doing anything in my power to survive. He was like the kaiji of the manga world, an ultimate survivor through and through. Looking back on it, Makura would realize that all the things people love about Nube would come as a result of his desperate battle for survival. Something that really stuck with me about Makura and Okano's journey, as opposed to many other mangaka, was that they never ever seemed to find their gimmick, one that would stabilize the manga's popularity and prevent them from being in danger of cancellation. Nube was a constant series of ups and downs, always increasing and then falling down in popularity, always trying new things and reinventing itself again and again. It never got to a point where the manga could go on autopilot and everything would be fine. Keeping all that in mind, it's ridiculously impressive that it was able to run for as long as it did. If there is one thing I feel any storyteller could learn from their journey, it's this. Whenever you feel like you've backed yourself into a corner, don't be afraid to say screw it and try something completely different. It might give you just the push you need to keep going. Izuna's spin-off would run up until 2014, after which Nube would receive its first real sequel in the form of Hell Teacher Nube Neo. The sequel would star Kyoko, who, after being inspired by Nube, takes up a career in teaching and begins guiding a new generation of kids towards a brighter future. Except, it's not as easy as she initially thought. That's why she needs Nube to slash his way back into the picture and lend her his demon hand for the cause. One of the highlights of Neo is getting to catch up with most of Nube's previous students who are all grown up now. Even Nube and Yukime's weird child makes a comeback. Some are grown up in more ways than one. Miki's got ginormous badonkers now. It's a nice addition as a sort of epilogue to the main manga. With that said, Neo doesn't really do anything to stand on its own. Personally, I think the very premise of Neo diminishes the message of the original run's ending, which was all about moving on and starting a new chapter in your life. Nube returns to Domori to help Kyoko anyway, instead of letting her handle things on her own, essentially retracing his steps from the original manga. The new kids do have some funny designs though. Monkey. Hell Teacher Nube S would be a spin-off running in parallel with Neo, telling shorter, more light-hearted stories. But after Neo concluded, it became the official continuation of Neo, running for 4 volumes in total. Unfortunately, as of right now, there's only one translated chapter of Neo, and it seems to be one from the middle of the manga. It must be a really good one if they chose to translate it out of all of them. Let's check it out. Whoa, yowza! Currently, there's a brand new Nube anime on the horizon, and it seems like it's being kept under wraps for now. All I could gather was that it would be a modernized version of the Nube story. Whatever the case may be, hopefully this video gives you an idea of what Nube is all about, and you'll have a greater appreciation of the new show when it comes out. Nowadays, Nube has earned its status as a cult classic in Japan, spawning a live-action adaptation and being one of the most popular anime on the Japanese version of Netflix. It has been ingrained as an iconic part of the 90s for any Japanese person who grew up around that time. And half the goal of this video was to sort of highlight and understand why that is the case. The series never got a chance to flourish in the West, but I could have totally seen it air on Adult Swim, slotted somewhere in between Tenchi Muyo and Dragon Ball Z. It's a shame the series was never brought over in any capacity, but I'm sure the new show will serve to change that soon enough. Meisuke Nueno is one hell of a teacher, and I will never forget all the invaluable lessons he taught me through his manga. I will hold them in my heart and pass them on to others as I continue my own journey through life, much like Nube himself. Nube is a character who's able to give people the courage to believe in themselves. He's that one final push you need from behind in order to be able to spread your wings and catch flight. He's there to remind you that you can take that leap and everything will be alright in the end. Once you've learned this final lesson and surpassed all of his teachings, then all there is to be said in the end is, class dismissed. I'd like to thank all of you for sticking with me until the end. This was a really fun one to put together, and I hope I was able to do Nube justice with this video. There's still more to come, so if you like my style, feel free to stick around and tune in for everything else I've got prepared for you. That's all the time I had for now though, so until I see you again, take care of yourselves and keep cool. Janesu. Oh, by the way, I know I screwed up the audio in the Kinnikumen video, so you can stop reminding me of it. I'm going insane.